Beneath the glittering chandeliers and beneath the velvet hush of throne rooms, there lurked a specter more terrifying than any rebel army or foreign invader. This was an enemy that could not be routed on the battlefield, nor negotiated away in treaty halls. It heralded its approach not with rolling drums, but with the faintest flutter of the heart, the slow creep of numbness, the unpredictable fever that came in the dead of night. Over centuries, it seeped into royal bloodlines, carrying both crown and curse, shaping destinies in silent conspiracy. Tonight, we begin our chronicle of 10 monarchs and heirs whose lives were shadowed and ultimately unraveled by illnesses they could neither confess nor conquer. No trumpet fanfares, no royal proclamations, just the hush of court gossip, the furtive glances behind tapestry folds, and the inexorable march of disease through sinew and nerve. Let us draw back the heavy drapes of history and enter the first chamber of our tale. First, Mad King, George III and the Secret of the Scarlet Moon. When King George III rode into London in 1760, the city burst into celebration. He was only 22, young, handsome, and English to his very marrow, but beneath that healthy exterior lay a fault line that would fracture mind and kingdom for nearly 3 decades. Contemporary doctors spoke of his nervous distemper in hushed tones, attributing his violent rages, his aimless pacing through palace corridors, and his unpredictable mutterings to melancholy or overstudy. In private correspondence, his courtiers described sleepless nights spent watching him clutching at candle sconces, eyes wild, as though pursued by phantoms. It would be many years before the modern diagnosis emerged: acute intermittent porphyria, a hereditary metabolic disorder that causes the buildup of toxic chemicals in the body. In George's case, the porphyria attacks arrived in cycles, weeks or months of relative calm, followed by staggering pain, vomiting, seizures, and hallucinations that could last for days. His flesh remained intact, yet his mind danced on a razor's edge between sanity and oblivion. Imagine the scene: a summer evening at Kew Palace, warm light spilling through mullioned windows. The court has gathered for an intimate concert, strings and harpsichord dancing among flickering shadows. Suddenly, the king's face drains of color. He rises unsteadily, knocking over a chair, and strides into the garden, muttering about locusts in the swelling clouds. The musicians freeze. Courtiers murmur, the fits have come again. In private consultations, physicians administered tonics of tincture of iron and laudanum, hoping to soothe nerves but inadvertently fueling attacks. The laudanum, a tincture of opium, dulled pain but clouded judgment. George's flashes of temper became more violent. He once threatened to strike an attendant who failed to remove a goose-feather pillow he considered offensive. That offense would today earn him no more than a raised eyebrow. For a king in the late 18th century, it became proof of derangement. By 1788, the attacks grew frequent. Parliament convened committees to consider a Regency Act, placing power in the hands of his son. Letters between ministers speak of times when the king is not in his senses, and speculate on the best means to preserve the dignity of the crown. Amid these whispers, the queen wept behind closed doors, torn between loyalty and desperation. The great seclusion of 1810 saw King George's confinement in Windsor Castle. Guards posted at his door, servants warned to be silent. No music, no pageantry. Courtiers petitioned for audience and were turned away. Some claimed they heard him at night, shrieking that devils gnawed at his entrails. Others insisted he spoke lucidly, composing poetry about the moon's blood-red glow. Whether fever dream or divine vision, those verses survive in ghostly fragments. When George III finally died in 1820, few recognized he had been both potentate and prisoner of a disease he could not name. His legacy remains entwined with flint-hearted tyranny in Mel Gibson's film, yet the pages of medical history remember him instead as an early victim of porphyria's silent reign. Dusra, Prince Leopold, Duke of Albany, Victoria's hidden hemophiliac. To understand Prince Leopold's tragedy, one must first understand the late Victorian court, a glittering hive of pomp and ceremony, anchored by Queen Victoria's solemn devotion to duty. Her youngest son, Leopold, affectionately Leopoldine to his family, was born in 1853 with a secret fixed in his genes. Hemophilia, the royal disease, lurked in the blood of Queen Victoria's descendants, gifted to her through an unknowing French princess and then carried like a poisoned chalice into the British royal line. From earliest childhood, Leopold moved with caution. While his elder siblings leapt into the sandpits of Windsor Greystone, he clung to nursemaid's hands, frightened of the hidden bruise that might bloom from a single tumble. When he finally learned to ride, the Duke of Cambridge insisted on equerries close at hand, ready to lift him from the saddle at a stumble. Each molehill held the prospect of tragedy. As he matured, his intellectual gifts shone. The future scholar king's mind raced ahead of his frail body. He excelled at Cambridge, where professors praised his quick logic. Yet 3 times in his 20s, simple cuts or dental extractions led to hemorrhage so severe the palace physicians ordered complete stasis, a bedbound week, a litany of leeches, and anointing of the wound with styptic powders. His fiancée, Princess Helena of Waldeck-Pyrmont, recorded in her diary the silent grief of Leopold's mother. Victoria rose at dawn, hands clasped, tears ever present. She never ceased to pray that her darling boy might escape the fate of so many of his kin. When at last Leopold was married in 1882, the Queen wore black gloves throughout the ceremony, lest a single pinprick spill love and blood onto her sons. Wedding robes. For Leopold, the greatest horror came not at parties or on the battlefield, but at simple family gatherings. One summer afternoon at Balmoral, the prince caught in his riding coat a thorn from a rose bush. The tiny wound bled steadily. Within hours he was shivering with fever. Doctors bled his arm in desperation, believing that bad blood must be let. They did not know the irony that in his veins every drop was precious. By 1884, the prince's days blurred between private study and private pain. He championed the Leopold legislation, laws that protected children with disabilities, born of empathy for his own battered body. Yet despite his fervor, the court never wrote his illness into official biographies. The phrase hemorrhagic diathesis appears only in medical journals, while public histories note merely that he died after a short illness. Leopold's final episode came in March 1884. He fell at a family shooting party, striking his head on a rock. At first, he laughed off the concussion. He was used to caution. But in the dead of night, he grew incoherent, vomiting blood. His wife held him in her arms, weeping prayers into his ear. 6 hours later, the prince, scholar, legislator, and devoted son, breathed his last in Queen Victoria's presence. His death sent shockwaves through Europe, but no historian linked it explicitly to hemophilia until decades later. For a generation, the Duke's malady remained a whispered court secret, yet his story lives on in the charities that bear his name, and in the pale shadows behind Victorian portraits, where mothers press gloved hands to their sons' arms, terrified of the unseen hazard coursing within. Third, Charles VI of France, the mad king's veiled torment. In the flickering torchlight of Rouen Cathedral, the young Dauphin Charles knelt before his crown, poised to inherit a realm torn by faction and war. It was 1380, and the 100 Years' War still ravaged French soil. A divine right, they said, flowed through his veins, but so too did something darker, a hereditary predisposition to insanity that would earn him the sobriquet Charles the Mad. Early in his reign, small signs emerged. Court clerks recorded days when the king would wander the labyrinthine halls of Château de Vincennes, muttering to absent figures. Pages complained of finding him slumped in corridors, fingers mashing the soft mortar of the walls. In private diaries, nobles referred to the devils that claimed him at night. But publicly, no one dared speak the word insanity. It was beneath a king's dignity. Modern scholars suspect Charles suffered from schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, illnesses that would remain unnamed for centuries. But the medieval mind found other explanations: demonic possession, divine punishment, even the evil humors of the body. Physicians bled him regularly, offering no relief. Exorcisms were attempted, with priests chanting behind closed doors while attendants held the king down on iron couches. The most infamous episode occurred in 1392. Charles, on campaign against the Burgundians, suddenly drew his sword on his own provost marshal, accusing him of treason. Only the marshal's swift flight saved his life. The armies, aghast at their monarch's violence, refused to fight. A council declared the king unfit to rule and placed his brother Louis on the throne as regent. But the disease did not rest. Charles awoke from his rages with no memory of violence and no understanding of his brother's authority. Sometimes he believed himself made of glass, striking himself with his own scepter to prove he would not shatter. Other times, convinced he was a wild boar, he ate acorns in the royal park, growling at courtiers. He spent 23 years in semi-captivity, alternating between the Tuileries and the Bastille, watched over by governors who both feared and pitied him. Visitors whispered of tapestries stained with the marks of his claws. In summer, servants left cool baths waiting for the king, but he would refuse to bathe, convinced the water would turn him to stone. After his death in 1422, historians glossed over Charles's human failings, choosing instead to highlight his dynastic achievements. The madness? A footnote. The king was subject to certain infirmities in his understanding, but the impact on France was profound. The regency fractured royal authority, fueling rivalries that would embolden English forces. A land once united by fealty splintered beneath a mad king's invisible curse. As our candle gutters in the quiet of the next chamber, remember this: these three souls, king, prince, dauphin, faced battles no army could wage. Their palaces became prisons, their courts circuses of pity and fear, and yet history too often remembers them not for their suffering, but for their titles. Tomorrow night, we'll draw another deep breath and open the doors to 4 more royals, each bearing a hidden burden that would reshape their fates and the fate of kingdoms. Until then, keep your lamps trimmed and your eyes wide to the secrets that flicker just beyond the flame. Fourth, crowned in silence, Empress Elizabeth, Sisi of Austria's invisible agony. The ballrooms of Vienna glittered like constellations come alive whenever Empress Elizabeth of Austria, known to her intimates as Sisi, swept through on slender limbs like a swan carved of moonlight. Courtiers held their breath not just at her beauty. Dark hair spilled like ink down her back, her eyes deep pools of summer sky, but also at her uncanny reserve. She spoke little, laughed seldom, and sometimes vanished from court life entirely, retreating into the quiet refuge of wooded estates or the steamer cabins that carried her across Europe's rivers. Only later did historians piece together the true burden she bore, a chronic, immobilizing pain that modern medicine now recognizes as a form of severe gastrointestinal disorder, likely exacerbated by the era's crude treatments and her own obsessive exercise regimens. In those gilded chambers, with the music drifting from gilded harps and chandeliers trembling overhead, Sisi appeared the very personification of grace. Yet behind those serene portraits was a woman waging daily war against her own flesh. She awoke in the dawn's hush with nausea that curled her into a fetal position, long before the first maid drew back her silk curtains. Breakfast, the formal ritual of eggs, delicate pastries, and tiny cups of coffee, would pass uneaten as she clutched her stomach with white-knuckled hands. Doctors, summoned at her own insistence, probed with wooden fingers and prescribed milk cures, hydrotherapy, and laudanum to dull the relentless cramps that rattled her spine like a prisoner in irons. None worked. She disguised her hunched posture with elaborate gowns, corsets tightened to a breaking point, skirts hooped wide enough to conceal the agony beneath. At public audiences, she would lean into the arms of aides, offering perfunctory smiles that never reached her gaze. Diplomatic cables noted her pallor and delicate constitution, attributing her absences to melancholia and an artful shyness. Few guessed that every carriage ride across Vienna's cobblestones was a torture test, each bump a fresh wave of pain that stole her breath. When at last she bore her first child, a daughter who would become Empress of Bavaria, doctors warned against further pregnancies. Each miscarriage risked not only her fragile health, but her life. Sisi ignored them. She believed motherhood might heal her, that the miracle of birth could cleanse her of whatever demons lurked in her gut. The courtroom rejoiced at news of her long-awaited heirs, a boy, Archie Francis Joseph, and later daughter Maria Christina. Yet every jubilation echoed hollowly for Sisi. In the nursery's pastel calm, she lay prostrate with fever and cramps, too weak to cradle her newborn son, tears dampening her white gloves. As the years turned, Sisi's illness mutated. The prescribed laudanum, a gift of opioids, eased the pain but birthed shadows in her mind. moments of dissociation so profound she would stare at her own hand as though it were another woman's. In Vienna's mirror-lined corridors, she practiced poses for hours, convinced that perfect symmetry would ward off what she called the hunger specter gnawing at her insides. Her beauty regime became a private mania. Daily horseback rides to the outskirts of the city, rigorous gymnastic routines, baths and fresh milk, all attempts to sculpt her body into an edifice of health against the encroaching decline within. Her public appearances dwindled to a mournful minimum. At the grand coronation of Hungary's parliament in 1867, she ascended the throne on white-gloved hands, greeting nobles with a soft "Grüß Gott," then retreated to private chambers so swiftly that diplomats whispered of a phantom empress. Her husband, Emperor Franz Joseph, mourned her absences but dared not press the issue. Court etiquette demanded deference, not inquiries into her well-being. In state letters he would write, "Her Majesty's spirits waver, but her courage never falters," a careful cipher for the collapse of her health. When Sisi finally fell gravely ill in 1889, an outbreak of peritonitis doctors diagnosed, it was as though her body had declared open rebellion. She boarded a Mediterranean steamer to Corfu, hoping the sea air would comfort her ravaged system. Instead, she grew delirious with fever, racked by pains so fierce they left her gasping like an animal. Physicians bled her repeatedly, believing bad blood must be drained. She died in the sterile gloom of an achy bedroom, not from the official peritonitis, but from years of untreated internal torment and the iatrogenic damage of 19th century medicine. Vienna's newspapers printed the Empress's death in somber black banners, the public read of a royal malady and an untimely decline, but none suspected the full measure of her suffering, a brilliant, restless spirit chained by an invisible illness she could neither name nor escape. Eindam, the Habsburg jaw's silent strain, Archduke Ferdinand's hidden malady. If any royal silhouette embodied the tragic irony of inherited infirmity, it was Archduke Ferdinand of Austria-Est, heir to the thrones of Austria and Hungary until a lone gunshot diverted the course of history. His slight frame and nervous habit of twisting his lips into a half-smile betrayed a lifetime spent grappling with a less-known affliction. Congenital mandibular deformity combined with a chronic respiratory weakness that modern researchers link to congenital syphilis. Ferdinand's childhood portraits show a cherubic face framed by soft curls, lips parted in a gentle curl. Yet as he matured, his jaw failed to align properly, impeding speech and swallowing. Each word required an exertion of will that left him breathless, cheeks flushed. Court tutors instructed him patiently, "Enunciate, Archduke." But in hushed halls, servants called him the stumbling prince, though never to his face. His condition deepened with adolescence. Palatal ulcers, a hallmark of latent syphilis, erupted in secret, and his voice faltered with pain. Physicians prescribed gargles of mercury chloride, a caustic remedy that left his mouth inflamed and scarred. He retreated behind high collars, his hand often shielding a trembling chin. In large assemblies at Schönbrunn Palace, he remained in the far recesses, listening politely, answering rarely. Yet Ferdinand's spirit defied his body. Under the wing of Franz Joseph, he cultivated interests in railroad engineering, linguistics, and the arts. He spoke 6 languages and corresponded with leading scientists of his day. Yet the strain of public speaking, even in private councils, triggered choking fits. One minister recalled a session when Ferdinand cleared his throat so sorely, the entire room fell silent. "Might a glass of water, Your Imperial Highness?" the minister ventured, but the Archduke shook his head, his lips blistered and continued as though brushing away a phantom. In 1914, at Sarajevo's welcoming ceremonies, his chronic laryngitis turned to acute pneumonia when a sudden rain soaked his suit. Medical attention was rudimentary, but the immediate concern was political. The assassination attempt overshadowed all else. Days later, after the bombing and Nicholas II's telegraph exchanges, the Archduke's final agony unfolded. He slipped into feverish delirium, gasping for breath in a Sarajevo hospital room. Before morphine could dull his pain, his lungs collapsed and his heart gave out. His death tore at the Habsburg fabric, but the whisper of congenital syphilis remained buried beneath state communique that blamed sympathetic shock and exhaustion. Yet later autopsies of his tissues would find the characteristic lesions and bone deformities of syphilis. His silent struggle, eclipsed by headlines of war, became a footnote for contemporaries. But to modern eyes, it stands as emblematic of the hidden burden borne by so many of his forebears. Shasti, the tragic heir of Portugal, King João VI's distant legacy. Across the Atlantic in gilded Brazil, where Portugal's royal court fled amid Napoleonic invasions, King João VI of Portugal reigned over tropical palaces draped with silk and stucco opulence. Yet the velvet splendor masked a slow, inexorable decline in his mind, a condition now theorized by psychologists as Alzheimer's disease in its nascent stages, aggravated by chronic hypertension and diabetes that clinicians at the time failed to recognize. João arrived in Rio de Janeiro in 1808 as a vigorous man, robust and eager to fashion a new Lusitanian empire on Brazilian soil. He rode along Copacabana's shores, attended masked balls at Paço Imperial, and commissioned grandiose art pieces celebrating Portuguese glory. But as years wore on, courtiers observed him in private moments, pacing lavish salons in silent confusion, forgetting the names of ministers, only to recover moments later with a polite nod. A document from 1812 reads, "His Majesty asked thrice the identity of the Foreign Secretary, then dismissed him with commendation as though enlightened all along." Behind closed doors, the court's physician spoke of old age creeping unchecked, prescribing elixirs of snake root and brandy, a combination that only exacerbated his tremors and blurred cognition. In moments of lucidity, João would confide to his confessor that "the palace seems not my own, the ministers not my subjects." On one fateful afternoon, the king sat enthroned as usual, only to rise and wander into a private quarters to fetch a document he no longer remembered requesting. He stood at a library desk for hours, his gaze lost among leather spines. By 1821, his health had deteriorated. The Cortes of Lisbon demanded his return to Europe to restore constitutional monarchy. João, confused by the orders, agreed on one condition, that the crown remain with his adored son Pedro, now proclaimed Emperor of independent Brazil. A letter to Pedro reads, "My mind drifts like a ship without anchor. I see your imperial banners and find comfort in your strength, for my own falters under an unnamable weight." He departed Rio in 1821, arriving in Lisbon a figure of regal disorientation. At the reconvened Portuguese parliament, he took his seat, but when the session commenced, he lay back, eyes shut, murmuring prayers. His speeches grew shorter, punctuated by long pauses. Ministers exchanged looks across dusty volumes of legal codes. Eventually, the king ceased attending entirely, delegating day-to-day affairs to regents while he retreated to royal estates at Queluz, a faded monument to a once thriving court. He died in 1826, a frail man claiming only to have sunk into endless slumber. Official bulletins cited a brief decline, the polite euphemism for a mind unmoored. But in letters preserved by palace archivists, the final pages bear João's trembling script. "In the fog of this twilight, I see your faces, Father, Son, Dauphin, and know I fade. Forgive me the shadows in my days." In these three lives, Sisi's silent stomach, Archduke Ferdinand's hidden scars, and João VI's fading mind, we see a tapestry woven with unseen threads. Disease does not announce itself with banners or fanfare. It slides through palace gates beneath the guise of etiquette, staining silver goblets, stealing midday pageantry, and whispering its secret in the most august of ears. As the candles gutter low in your own hidden chambers, remember, power and prestige are no shield, and sometimes the fiercest battles rage within. Tonight, we stand at the halfway mark of our journey. In the depths of the next installment, we shall unveil the final four royals, whose destinies were carved by invisible hands, diseases that reshaped empires and left their names unspoken in the halls of history. 7th, Charles II of Spain, the Habsburgs' hapless heir. By the time Charles II ascended the Spanish throne in 1665, the once formidable Habsburg Empire was already creaking under the weight of decades of inbreeding, war, and fiscal collapse. Europe's diplomats whispered that the young king, scarcely 14, bore the grim burden of generations of genetic misfortune, a withered body so frail it trembled even as he sat upon the gilded chair of state, and a mind so clouded he needed reminders to breathe and swallow. From infancy, Charles had been attended by a legion of wet nurses, tutors, and doctors, each convinced that the next potion or dietary regimen might invigorate the royal blood. But nothing could reverse the Habsburg jaw that left him unable to chew without pain, nor the malformed palate that forced him to sip soups through a hollow reed. Court physicians prescribed mercury elixirs to purge corrupt humors, yet these only corroded his insides further, turning gentle fevers into bouts of delirium. In public, when the Spanish court still summoned the courage, Charles would stand beneath tapestries depicting his imperial ancestors, his gaunt frame swallowed by opulent robes. He spoke in monosyllables, his words mumbled through trembling lips, and even then he often grew exhausted before completing a single sentence. Ambassadors wrote home that he looks half alive, as though the faintest breeze might carry him off, and some speculated darkly that he might never father an heir. Behind the palace corridors, power toppled like dominoes. Regent queens and favorite courtiers jockeyed for influence, staging coups in whispers and secret letters. Spain's once proud armies withdrew from the Netherlands, Catalonia simmered in revolt, and French musketeers prowled the Pyrenees. To many, it seemed the Habsburg dynasty itself lay dying in Charles's frail chest. Yet the most tragic element of Charles's reign was not political collapse, but the human cost. He endured frequent dropsies, edema, painful kidney stones, and ulcerations that left him delirious with agony. On one occasion, he collapsed in the royal chapel mid-prayer, convulsing so violently courtiers feared he would expire on the marble floor beneath the crucifix. Physicians, powerless, smeared his limbs with heated bread and crushed bean poultice, rituals as futile as they were grotesque. When Charles II finally died in 1700, still unmarried, still childless, the European balance of power tipped into the War of Spanish Succession. But for the king himself, the final hours were shrouded in astonishing cruelty. Courtiers barred family members from his bedside, fearing the sight of his wasted form would spread despair. After death, his body was embalmed in a cumbersome lid coffin, his entrails preserved separately, so that foreign princes might view the remains with dignity. Few grieved, and fewer ever understood the silent torment he had endured. Charles II was more a prisoner to his own genome than to any rebel army, and his hapless reign marked both the end of Habsburg Spain and a testament to a hidden, hereditary malady that no crown could ever cure. Et dom, Joanna of Castile, la loca, love, madness, and hidden melancholia, born in 1479 as the third child of the formidable Ferdinand and Isabella. Princess Joanna of Castile was reared to rule a kingdom, but she grew up ruled by a mind as mercurial as the sea she adored. From the day she watched her mother execute a rebel in Seville's plaza, Joanna's heart moved between devotion and despair. By the time she married Philip the Handsome of Burgundy in 1496, she was already prone to fits of weeping so intense that advisors feared her life was forfeit. In private letters, her mother wrote tenderly of Joanna's fear of storms at sea, her early tears at every funeral, and her obsessive need to document Philip's words in dripping ink. Courtiers dubbed her La Loca in hushed French, but to her family, the true affliction was a searing melancholia that attacked without warning. Scholars now suggest she may have suffered from what we would recognize as bipolar disorder, with depressive episodes so profound she could not rise from bed for days, and manic bursts in which she laughed wildly at funerals and danced through convent halls at midnight. After Philip's unexpected death in 1506, dying suddenly of typhoid fever during a journey through Spain, Joanna's mind fractured irreparably. She refused to accept his death, ordering daily rituals at his corpse in the royal palace of Tordesillas, laying her cheek against his cold cheekbone, stroking his hands and demanding he open his eyes. Physicians of the era, convinced she was possessed, tried exorcisms and bloodletting. When these failed, they turned to broths of hemlock and mandrake, poisons intended to draw out the evil spirits, but only deepening her torpor. Her father Ferdinand seized the opportunity to assume regency, isolating Joanna in a remote fortress. Locked away with only her own attendants, she spent years singing lullabies to Philip's embalmed body, her voice growing hoarse as the seasons turned. Courtiers spoke of her strolling in the gardens at dawn, her black gown trailing behind, conversing with shadows, and of nights when she'd wake, shriek, and beat her head against stone walls. When Isabella died in 1504, Joanna technically inherited Castile, yet she was never allowed to rule. Her son, Charles V, was proclaimed monarch in her stead, while she remained a prisoner, neither queen nor commoner. Despite intermittent visits by sympathetic nuns and the occasional note from Charles, Joanna's life dwindled to a litany of silent halls, pilgrimage roads she paced in chains, and the soft toll of convent bells marking hours she could no longer discern. Her death in 1555, at age 75, did little to erase the memory of her suffering. She was buried beside Philip in Granada's royal chapel, her hair braided into the linen shroud, as if to reunite her tortured spirit with the husband she refused to release. Today, historians debate the ethics of her confinement, the culpability of her parents, and the cruelty of hiding a queen behind stone walls. But beyond politics, her story endures as a harrowing testament to how untreated mental illness, and society's fear of it, can consign even the highest born to a life worse than death. Diaries, Tsar Ivan III. The terrible, neurosyphilis in the making of a monarch, Ivan IV Vasilievich, crowned the first Tsar of all Russia in 1547, was a man of extremes. His reign consolidated autocracy and expanded Muscovite territory, but behind the iron mask of sovereignty lay a mind eroded by unseen disease. Modern retroactive diagnoses point to neurosyphilis as a key factor shaping his infamous cruelty and paranoia, an illness he likely contracted during his youth, passed through clandestine liaisons in the Kremlin's red-walled chambers. Early in his rule, Ivan displayed flashes of generosity and piety, founding schools, churches, and humanitarian charitable courts for the poor. Yet intermittent fevers and agonizing headaches, kept secret by order of the patriarch, would seize him without warning. He learned to bear these attacks alone, for physicians feared his rage more than his suffering. Mercury ointments were applied to his temples. Bandages soaked in herbal decoctions were tied around his skull. None quelled the internal tempest. By the 1570s, the episodes grew more sinister. Ivan began experiencing auditory hallucinations, voices warning of conspiracies, whispers in empty halls. His writings from this period, preserved in the Kremlin archives, alternate between devout hymns and frantic lists of traitors to be executed. In one entry, he commands the execution of 50 worst enemies, an order he revoked hours later under church council, only to reissue it again at dawn, citing divine instruction. His personal physician, Afanasy Shuravy, eventually recorded Ivan's, quote, symptoms in a hidden journal: tremors in his hands, difficulty with complex speech, fits of mania followed by profound stupor. But the Tsar forbade this document's publication. Any acknowledgement of disease, especially one so stigmatized, threatened the divine aura he cultivated. Rumors spread instead of poisoning and witchcraft. Boyars were tortured for sourcing the Tsar's infirmities, while Ivan roamed the palace with a heavy mace, ready to smite neighbors for imagined slights. The culmination of Ivan's neurosyphilis came in 1581, when in a drunken rage he struck his own son, Ivan Ivanovich, on the head with his scepter. The heir died hours later, and with him vanished any hope of a stable succession. Tsar papers thereafter note only an unfortunate accident, but behind closed doors, court physicians despaired, recognizing the neurological collapse at work. Ivan IV died in 1584, 4 years after his son's death, amid a final convulsion of paranoia so intense he believed even his trusted advisors conspired to bury him alive. He spent his last nights in his private chapel, clutching an icon of Saint Basil, murmuring prayers to stave off the inner worms gnawing at his mind. When he passed, his body was interred beneath the cathedral of the Dormition, but his hidden malady remained buried more deeply, unspoken in chronicles, denied in sermons, erased from the official hagiographies that painted him as a flawed but divinely appointed ruler. In these three heirs, Charles II's genetic curse, Joanna's tragic confinement, and Ivan the Terrible's unseen neurosyphilis, we see how illness can twist the highest thrones into cages of agony and suspicion. Their crowns offered no protection from the scourges of flesh and mind. In the final installment, we will unveil the 10th and concluding monarch, one whose battlefield was not a foreign land, but the very palace corridors, and whose hidden affliction reshaped a nation's destiny in ways both shocking and profound. Until then, let the hushed corridors of history remind you that true power lies not in the gilded scepter, but in the fragile vessel that wields it. Bloodline, Christian, the 7th of Denmark, a kingdom held hostage by madness. On a frosty December morning in 1766, the 18-year-old Christian VII ascended the Danish throne beneath the grim spires of Frederiksborg Castle. Tall and fair, with an easy smile that recalled his beloved English grandmother, Queen Caroline, he seemed destined to bring light to a court still shrouded in the aftermath of his father's stern, Calvinist reign. Yet within a year, courtiers would whisper of sudden mood swings, of days when Christian greeted them with gracious banter, and nights when he raged at invisible conspirators. By the time he reached 20, the young king's mind teetered on a razor's edge between exuberant brilliance and catatonic despair, an illness so misunderstood that it would render Denmark a pawn on the European chessboard for decades to come. A promising young sovereign unraveling Christian's early life was a sequence of contradictory pressures. Groomed for kingship by tutors schooled in Enlightenment thought, yet raised in a court steeped in pietistic austerity. His education brimmed with poetry, philosophy, and the nascent sciences, but each lecture left him restless, eyes darting as though reading distant hallucinations. His first ministers recorded marvel at the young sovereign's conversation. Never before had Frederiksborg's salons witnessed such wit and curiosity. Yet the same dispatches noted darker moments. Christian suddenly ceasing mid-sentence, hands clasped over his ears, as though the words themselves had wounded him. By mid-1767, the court physician Johann Friedrich Struensee, a German doctor newly summoned to Denmark, began treating the king's nervous complaints. Struensee's own journals, later hidden and nearly destroyed, describe Christian enduring weeks of listlessness, refusing food, and staring into flames for hours. He would lie awake all night, quivering in terror at distant noises no one else could hear. Struensee administered tinctures of valerian and laudanum, believing the king suffered from a reprehensible excess of sensory impressions. But relief proved fleeting. Each cure seemed to trigger deeper crashing troughs of depression. Historians now speculate Christian may have suffered from a severe form of bipolar disorder, perhaps compounded by temporal lobe epilepsy, conditions that would remain undiagnosed for centuries. His manic periods burst forth in flamboyant fashions. One spring afternoon, he ordered a sudden carriage procession to the seaside, insisting he would serenade the waves. Nobles obliged, shivering in silk coats as Christian leapt from the coach, brandishing a violin, and played bawdy tunes for startled fishermen. 2 hours later, he collapsed beside a clump of dunes, weeping for the lost time of his youth. The rise of Struensee, enlightenment and betrayal. Struensee's role swiftly expanded beyond court physician. He recognized that Christian's episodic lucidity offered a rare opening to push through radical reforms, abolishing torture, easing press censorship, and attempting to codify laws to protect peasants. Under Struensee's influence, the king issued nearly 1,800 royal decrees in less than a year, an unprecedented administrative purge aimed at modernizing Denmark along Enlightenment lines. But every decree bore the stain of the king's instability. When Christian improved, he reveled in Struensee's success, bestowing honors and lavish gifts upon his protege. When Christian relapsed, he branded Struensee a charlatan, threatening him with the wheel and accusing him of bewitching the monarch. Struensee, torn between genuine loyalty and self-preservation, began to wield power in Christian's name, controlling access to the king and orchestrating audiences. In a sense, Denmark had two rulers, a king confined by his own mind, and a de facto regent whose brilliance was matched only by his peril of overreach. The court whisperers, led by Queen Dowager Juliana Maria and the king's young estranged brother Frederick, capitalized on rumors of the doctor's ensorcelment. They circulated tales that Christian's madness was worsened by forbidden liaisons. Struensee had gained influence not just through medicine, but through an illicit affair with Queen Caroline Matilda herself, the king's young, sympathetic consort. Whether true or courtly calumny, the story stoked public outrage. The sovereign was besieged by foreign venom in his bedchamber, they claimed, and the kingdom's very soul was at stake. The coup and isolation. On the cold dawn of January 17th, 1772, palace guards loyal to Juliana Maria and Prince Frederick burst into Christian's chambers at Christiansborg Palace. They found the king slumped over a writing desk, pen in hand but eyes vacant, mouthing the syllables of a half-finished essay on natural rights. He was clothed in disheveled night robes, the chamber strewn with discarded prescriptions and empty wine goblets. With tears in their eyes, attendants gently lifted him from his chair, shrouded him in a velvet cloak, and carried him, still muttering to himself, into formal, protective custody. Struensee was arrested that very day, tried in secret, and executed by beheading 2 months later. Queen Caroline Matilda was divorced, shipped to Tell in Hanover, and so forbidden from returning to Denmark that she died under house arrest 3 years later, aged just 23. In the midst of this dramatic purge, Christian VII was declared incapacitated, and a regency council, headed by Juliana Maria, ruled in his stead. Denmark's Enlightenment experiment crumbled overnight. Books were burned, reforms rescinded, and ministers purged by the dozens. To many outside the palaces, it appeared Christian's madness had finally claimed the throne. The once celebrated sovereign became a living ghost in his own courts, a cautionary tale of folly and moral danger. Yet behind closed doors, those who cared for him recognized the tragedy. A bright mind, shackled by a malady neither sin nor treason, had been abandoned by the very structures sworn to protect him. Final years, and death. Over the next 2 decades, Christian sank into a quieter form of despair. He was moved first to the palace at Amalienborg, then to Rosenborg, and eventually sequestered at Frederiksberg, a suburban retreat where the gardens were kept meticulously trimmed to mask the isolation within. His attendants were forbidden to speak of his illness. Visitors were limited to ceremonial audiences on designated days. In private, he spent his hours reading French novels aloud to himself, sketching landscapes of imagined realms, and composing melancholy verses that survive only as scattered fragments in royal archives. Occasionally, the king would emerge in fleeting lucid periods. On one such afternoon in 1784, he received a young diplomat who described conspiracies in the Ottoman Empire. Christian listened gravely, asked incisive questions, and drafted astute diplomatic instructions. As the guest departed, he remarked on the sovereign's brilliant recovery. But the next morning, Christian was found in his bedchamber, rocking back and forth, rasping a lullaby he had sung as a boy, oblivious to both time and person. On March 13, 1808, after a sudden fever and a week of convulsive tremors, Christian VII slipped away, aged only 59. His official obituary spoke of a gentle monarch oppressed by secret ailments, attributing his death to a chronic nervous condition complicated by age. There was no mention of the regency coup, no hint of the palace intrigues that had riven the kingdom, and certainly no acknowledgement of the torment that had defined much of his reign. The unseen scars of power. Christian VII's life and death epitomized the silent havoc wrought by untreated mental illness in an age before psychiatry. His reign, though brief and bookended by regents, left a paradoxical legacy. Denmark's fleeting embrace of Enlightenment ideals, followed by a retrenchment into conservative monarchy. The dramatic rise and fall of a royal physician whose reforms would later inspire future generations, and the tragic unraveling of a young king whose gifts were eclipsed by forces beyond his control. His story reminds us that monarchs, despite their gilded courts and divine right, are mortal, vulnerable to the same illnesses that stalk commoners in the streets. Christian VII wore his crown and his chains both. The madhouse was no less real for being hidden behind palace doors. And though Denmark marched on into the 19th century under more stable rulers, the memory of a sovereign held hostage by his own mind would linger in popular ballads and whispered legends, a testament to the fragile boundary between sovereignty and surrender. As our journey through hidden royal maladies draws to a close, we have visited 10 lives shattered by ailments too shameful or mysterious to name. From sores that undermine dynasties to minds ensnared by invisible demons, these kings and queens reveal that illness, above all else, knows no station. Their courts, once the pinnacle of power, became stages for private tragedies, played out in silence while history turned its page. May these tales of agony and endurance remind us that true courage often dwells not in banners and battlefields, but in the quiet chambers where dignity and despair collide. First, Charles VI of France, the Mad Dauphin who became the Mad King. The court of Charles VI shimmered with silken banners and the splendor of a realm at the height of its medieval glory. Yet behind the tapestried walls of the Louvre, a silent storm gathered. Charles inherited the crown at only 12 years old, a slender boy thrust onto a throne he could not yet fill. In the bright summer of 1388, he first showed signs of what modern scholars would call schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. Days of radiant energy spent composing hymns in candlelight, followed by weeks of sullen withdrawal behind locked doors, where he scratched indecipherable symbols into the plaster. On November 5, 1392, the fragile balance shattered. Accompanied by his uncle Louis of Orleans on a campaign against the Burgundians, Charles suddenly snatched his swords and charged at his own provost marshal, accusing him of treachery. Soldiers recoiled as their king's face contorted in rage. Only Louis's intervention saved the marshal's life and France's fragile unity. That day, the crown fractured. A regency was declared, power passed to his uncle, and Charles was confined to the royal apartments under constant guard. Yet confinement did not cure him. It only deepened the mystery. Some nights, servants reported, pale candlelight flickered beneath his door, long after the rest of the palace had fallen silent. Behind the tapestries, they heard soft chanting, prayers to saints and sometimes to spirits. In the morning, the king emerged calm as dawn, offering gentle orders, resuming audiences as if the previous night's frenzy were a dream. Physicians applied the humoral theory. They bled him, administered purgatives, wrapped his limbs in poultices of herbs and animal fat. When these failed, exorcists were summoned to cast out demons. Priests intoned Latin litanies while attendants held Charles's wrists to prevent him from scratching his eyes. Yet the infirmity of the mind only worsened. By 1407, Charles wandered the palace corridors in a blood-stained tunic, convinced he had been transformed into a wild boar. Courtiers spoke of avoiding him, crossing themselves at the sight of his vacant stare. Despite the illness that rendered him sometimes incapable of ruling, Charles VI remained titular monarch for 30 years. He signed treaties, blessed armies bound for battle, and presided over courts of law on lucid days. On mad ones, his brother Louis took his place, forging alliances France would later rue. The mental fracture at the heart of the Valois court helped tip the 100 Years' War in England's favor, and plunged France into decades of civil war between Armagnac and Burgundian factions. When Charles died in 1422, pale and thin but still enthroned, chroniclers wrote of his many sorrows and the shadows upon his mind. They praised his piety, his lyric poetry, hints of a gentle spirit trapped in a broken vessel. Yet it was a reign haunted not by foreign armies, but by the king's own wavering sanity, a reign in which the greatest battles were fought in chambers sealed against the world. Dusra, George III of England, the king whose mind went to war. In the spring of 1760, London erupted in celebration when young George III ascended the British throne. He brought promise of stability after years of imported Hanoverian kings, and the nation rejoiced. But beneath the powdered wig and gold-embroidered coat lurked a hereditary illness, acute intermittent porphyria, that would seize the king's body and mind for decades. The first attack struck in 1765. Severe abdominal pain so intense George could neither stand nor speak. Physicians of the day, baffled by purple urine and vomiting, leaned on mercury and opiates, inadvertently worsening his condition. By the early 1780s, fits of mania gripped him. He would wander Windsor Castle at night, tearing tapestry from the walls, convinced his heir was plotting murder. On one occasion, he attacked his own physicians with a candlestick, leaving them bruised and terrified. In 1788, as Parliament debated war with the American colonies, George's condition plunged into crisis. He refused to see ministers, locked himself in Goring House, and raged at imaginary conspirators. Court physicians delivered fragmented reports. His Majesty raves of demons in the walls, and speaks of Spanish plots with foaming lips. Behind palace screens, courtiers drafted the Regency Act, planning to invest the Prince of Wales with royal power should George remain incapacitated. Yet as suddenly as it began, the madness receded. In 1789, George awoke calm and apologetic, praising God for restored reason. The Regency Bill collapsed, Parliament breathed relief, and the king resumed rule, never publicly acknowledging his illness. But the cycles continued every few years. By 1810, his mental indisposition forced a formal regency under the Prince Regent. George died in 1820, blind and bereft of speech, but by then remembered more for the loss of the American colonies than for the secret war waged within his own body. His reign, marked by Enlightenment patronage and empire building, also bore the hidden scars of porphyria, periodic breakdowns that strained the monarchy and left Britain to question anew the divine right of kings. Third, Ivan IV, the Terrible of Russia, madness crowned in blood. When Ivan IV Vasilievich crowned himself Tsar in 1547, he promised a new era for Muscovy, one of centralized power and orthodox revival. Yet, the boy who had survived the ruthless intrigues of his regency court also carried a darkness. Modern historians attribute Ivan's escalating paranoia and brutal outbursts to neurosyphilis contracted in his youth, perhaps through courtly debauchery or clandestine prostitution. In the early years, Ivan showed flashes of generosity, founding orphanages and endowing churches, but intermittent fevers and agonizing headaches, recorded in monastic chronicles, would seize him without warning. During these bouts, he roamed the Kremlin with a hunting mace, dispatching boyars and generals on mere suspicion of disloyalty. In his diary, later suppressed, he described a whispering demons in the battlements and invoked Saint or Nicholas to purge traitors. The defining tragedy came on November 19, 1581. Consumed by fury over a quarrel with his son and heir, Ivan struck the prince on the head with his iron scepter. Mortally wounded, the boy, only 27, died within hours. Court chronicles called it an unfortunate accident, but eyewitnesses recalled the Tsar's anguished scream as he cradled his bleeding child. In his final years, Ivan's mental collapse deepened. He believed even his closest advisors were spirits in disguise, insulating himself in a fortified cell within the Kremlin, attended only by a few loyal servants. On March 18, 1584, he suffered a grand mal-seizure, probably neurosyphilitic in origin, and died, leaving Muscovy reeling. His reign is remembered for neither benevolence nor reform, but for the terror he unleashed in his own court. Under his oprichnina, the secret police slaughtered entire towns, painting the land with blood. Yet behind every bayonet and blazing village lay the hand of a ruler, whose disease twisted mercy into horror, devotion into suspicion, and piety into persecution. Fourth, Christian VII of Denmark, the Enlightenment. King who lost his mind, the young Christian VII arrived in Copenhagen in 1766 as a breath of fresh Enlightenment air. Educated by Enlightenment tutors, he spoke French and German, read Voltaire and Rousseau, and dreamed of modernizing his kingdom. But the pressure of royal expectation collided violently with a severe form of bipolar disorder, compounded, historians believe, by temporal lobe epilepsy, turning palace intrigue into a daily nightmare. In 1767, he fell under the care of Dr. Johann Friedrich Struensee, a progressive physician who saw Christian's illness not as demonic, but as a medical condition. Struensee administered laudanum, quinine, even early forms of shock therapy, attempting to regulate the king's erratic moods. As Christian oscillated between manic decrees and depressive withdrawal, Struensee seized power. For a brief year, he ruled Denmark through the king's signature, enacting sweeping reforms from abolishing torture to press freedom. But in January 1772, the court erupted. Accusations flew that Struensee was bewitching the king, aided by an illicit affair with Queen Caroline Matilda. Palace guards arrested Struensee, executed him by beheading, and confined Christian to a series of isolated palaces. The boy king, once bursting with promise, became a ghost in his own realm, seen only at formal audiences, then whisked away on conspiracy-laden rumors of fits and visions. For the next 3 decades, Christian drifted between pockets of lucidity, penning poetic reflections on mortality, and prolonged stupors, rocking himself to sleep in dimly lit chambers. In 1808, after a sudden fever and convulsive tremors, he died at 59, still king in name, but never in power. His truncated reign illustrates the tragedy of a sovereign whose best-laid enlightenment plans collapsed beneath the weight of untreated mental illness. Eindam, Henry VI of England, the innocent king consumed by shadows. In the spring of 1422, 8-year-old Henry VI was crowned King of England beneath the soaring vaults of Westminster Abbey, his small hand barely grasping the heavy orb as wax candles trembled in the draughty choir. He was the only son of Henry V, whose triumph at Agincourt had secured English dominion in northern France. But the prince inherited not only a kingdom, but an ancestral fault line, fragile mental health that would rend his reign and his realm apart. From earliest childhood, courtiers noted Henry's gentle disposition. He adored stories of saints and knights, preferring hagiographies to histories of conquest. Yet by age 12, uneasy murmurs arose. He would drift through corridors at Westminster Palace, pale and silent, lips moving as though reciting prayers no one else could hear. Tutors complained that he sometimes froze mid-sentence, staring at painted walls as if hidden apparitions danced within. When he reached his majority at 16, Henry VI ascended the throne in name, but remained a prisoner of apprehension. The demands of kingship, council debates, grant charters, deliver judgments, proved overwhelming. At council tables, he dog-eared speeches unread, offering a gentle nod when ministers spoke and vanishing afterward into private chambers, bedeviled by doubt. The turning point came in the summer of 1453. England's grip on Gascony slipped, and the French reclaimed Bordeaux. News arrived in London like a thunderclap. Henry, who had spent the morning in a sunlit garden pondering prayer beads, was led by trembling attendants to the painted chamber, where heralds delivered the defeat. His face drained of blood, he rose, trembling, and demanded to hear the words again. When they repeated them, he sank to his knees, sobbing, "My crown is little worth if it cannot keep what my father won." In the following months, the king's demeanor veered between spiritual ecstasy and catatonia. He lay for days under his canopy, insensible to voices fed by spoonfuls of broth. Physicians, still bound by humoral theory, bled him repeatedly, convinced that imbalanced black bile caused his collapses. Each bleed left him weaker. Each purge increased his listlessness. Meanwhile, English nobles, Yorkists, and Lancastrians saw opportunity in the king's infirmity. Richard of York, proud and ambitious, claimed guardianship over the king and the realm. He escorted Henry to Westminster Palace, announcing to the House of Lords that the kingdom needed a hand more steady than the lamb's. When Henry revived, he found himself captive to York's firm will. Though still king by title, he signed edicts he barely read. On Good Friday of 1454, Henry suffered his gravest breakdown. Summoned to open parliament, he trembled on the steps of the abbey, clutching the gilded pommel of his sword. He looked out at the assembled peers and said only, "I see nothing but a sea of faces." He turned away, retreated to the royal apartments, and did not return for 6 weeks. His abandoned throne remained empty until York's supporters forced a new regency council in his stead. Henry's collapse emboldened rival factions, igniting decades of the Wars of the Roses. He became a pawn, paraded before Parliament to affirm agreements he neither negotiated nor comprehended. Lancastrian lords, desperate to restore his authority, organized masked meetings and secret alliances. Yorkist rebels stormed London Bridge, proclaiming the king's recall, but Henry, still secluded, could not sanction their banners. By 1461, Edward of York claimed the crown as Edward IV. Henry VI languished first in the Tower, then on isolated estates cared for by a handful of devoted clerics. Yet every so often, on feast days when choir bells rang in royal chapels, he would slip free from caretakers, steal into the chapel, and kneel before the altar, petitioning God to restore his realm. His murmured psalms echoed through nave and crypt, unheard by courtiers but seared into Westminster stones. In 1470, a brief Lancastrian revival restored Henry to the throne. Crowds cheered as the gentle king rode through London, tears in his eyes. But the triumph was fleeting. Edward IV returned, and Henry was recaptured, returned to the Tower once more. On the night of May 21st, 1471, he was found dead in his cell. Some say of despair, more say of starvation, yet a broken heart was the likeliest culprit. When Parliament declared his death by the will of God, there was no mention of his mental torments. Yet Henry VI's story stands testament to a young sovereign whose innocence and piety could neither shield him from the rapacious ambitions of nobles, nor the crushing weight of a mind besieged by doubt and despair. Shasti, Caligula, the emperor who lost sight of Rome, long before he donned purple. Gaius Julius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus, was known affectionately as Caligula, the little boot, for the miniature military sandals he wore while trailing his father on campaigns. Rome celebrated the boy's return from Germania in 31 AD, a promise of continuity after the reign of Tiberius. But that brightness dimmed swiftly. Within months of becoming emperor in 37 AD, Caligula's mind bent towards something darker, something that would horrify the Senate and terrify the people of Rome. Contemporary accounts, though penned by historians hostile to his memory, speak of an early period of clemency. Caligula pardoned political exiles, distributed generous games, and lavished gifts upon the populace. Yet in the autumn of 37 AD he fell gravely ill. Ancient physicians record a fever so intense his limbs stiffened, and his breathing sounded like a dying swan. His wife and sisters stood vigil by his bedside, chanting prayers to Aesculapius, but for 3 days his pulse faltered, and doctors dared not touch him. When Caligula recovered, he was no longer the charming youth Rome had embraced. His eyes glittered with a fevered intensity. Witnesses reported he laughed at inappropriate moments and sobbed without cause. He claimed gods had whispered to him in delirious dreams, granting him divine authority. He began to dress in shades of gold, calling himself a living Jupiter, ordering temples to inscribe his likeness alongside the deities. Senators gasped when he stormed into the Curia Julia wearing lion skins, brandishing a whip, claiming he would hunt human prey in the Colosseum. He forced the Senate to vote on making his horse Incitatus a consul, then invited dignitaries to dine with the horse at a gilded stall, complete with a house of marble and an ivory manger. The line between ruler and lunatic blurred as Caligula's decrees grew more bizarre, demanding worship of his statue in every Roman household, ordering generals to collect seashells off the Gallic coast as spoils of the sea, and compelling parents to divorce unsuitable spouses on his erratic whims. Yet for all his ostentation, terror lay beneath the pageantry. Senators vanished in the night, dragged to the Tiber, or strangled in hidden prisons. Praetorian guards executed household staff on fabricated charges of conspiracies. Caligula's laughter echoed through the Palatine's pillared halls as he watched men chase shadows, enemies of the state, in mock trials. Modern scholars lean toward neuropsychiatric explanations: mercury poisoning from Pompeian tap water, temporal lobe damage from his near-fatal illness, or hereditary madness coursing through Julio Claudian veins. But to Romans of the era, these were not excuses but evidence of sacrilege. A living god unhinged from mortal reason. On January 24th, 41 AD, a group of praetorians led by Cassius Chaerea stabbed Caligula to death in a corridor of the Palatine. His wife and daughter were likewise slaughtered, their blood mingling in the dust. Rome exhaled, enthroned an uncle none had wanted, and erased Caligula's name from monuments. Yet whispers persisted. Did a lunatic thirst for blood, or did the empire drown a god-king in his moment of madness? Either way, Caligula's reign remains the darkest fable of power consumed by a diseased mind. 7th, Ludwig II of Bavaria, the fairy tale king ensnared by delusion. In 1864, at the age of 18, Ludwig II ascended the throne of Bavaria beneath Gothic spires and the fanfare of Bavarian brass bands. Portraits show him pale, slender, eyes deep-set, a dreamy youth garbed in ornate uniforms. He commissioned castles straight from Grimm's tales, Neuschwanstein, Linderhof, Herrenchiemsee, each designed to house his visions of medieval romance. But beneath the turrets and gilded bays lay a monarch whose mind was gradually detaching from reality. Ludwig was fascinated by Richard Wagner's operas, pining to live in a world of Tannhäuser and Lohengrin. He held private performances of Tristan und Isolde at midnight, his voice hushed, eyes shining with tears of longing. He spent hours in the ornate halls of Neuschwanstein, pacing beneath the murals of knights and swan maidens, as though hunting for a lost kingdom of the imagination. But the king's obsessions deepened into paranoia. He distrusted ministers, convinced they plotted to steal his throne. He forbade citizens from entering his forest, believing intruders laid enchantment spells upon the trees. When his cousin Otto, also king, began showing signs of mental instability, Ludwig feared he would be next. He demanded absolute secrecy from his doctors, refusing treatment unless they promised eternal silence. Behind closed doors, physicians observed Ludwig suffering from acute anxiety. He endured sleepless nights, pacing his lavish chambers, turning his wand-like fingers in his lap as though tuning a ghostly lute. He refused to eat without a strict ritual. Every meal had to be served at exactly the same hour, on the same porcelain, and lit by sconces placed at precise angles. Any deviation triggered tears or panic attacks. In 1886, under pressure from ministers alarmed by his remoteness and the kingdom's mounting debts, fueled by his vast building projects, the medical establishment declared Ludwig insane. Without examining him in person, 4 doctors drafted a report citing permanent mental disorientation, solitary tendencies, and delusions of grandeur. On June 10th, Ludwig was deposed in absentia. 2 days later, he strolled with his doctor along Lake Starnberg, conversing cheerfully about his next castle. At the lake's edge, witnesses found both men's bodies. Ludwig's pocket watch stopped at 6:56 p.m., water staining his outstretched hand. Some believed he drowned himself. Others whispered of assassination, a final betrayal by those who could not fathom a king's dreams. The world mourned the mad king whose fairy tale palaces still crown Bavarian hills. His castles remain monuments to a sovereign who quite literally built worlds in his mind. And while history labels him unbalanced, to many he endures a tragic romantic, a king whose greatest flaw was believing so fiercely in beauty that he lost all touch with a world unwilling to dream alongside him. Etom, Nero, Rome's youngest emperor in the flames of madness, in October the 54. 18-year-old Nero entered the purple room of the Domus Aurea, the golden palace his predecessors could scarcely imagine. Adopted by his great-uncle Claudius and hailed as a fresh face for Rome, Nero promised patronage of the arts, games to rival those of the Republic, and mercy for the vanquished. Yet within a year, his descent into tyranny, and what many historians attribute to manic episodes, became undeniable. Early in his reign, Nero dazzled Rome by singing on stage and competing in chariot races. He performed privately for the Senate, his voice praised by poets who swore by his divine inspiration. But he also grew paranoid. Certain that Rome's elite envied his youth and talent, he ordered the execution of his own mother Agrippina, first by collapsing a boat en route to Capri, then by dagger when she miraculously survived. Witnesses described Nero pacing the peristyle gardens in opium-tinged stupors, dictating poetry to slaves who burned incense to mask his tears. He spent entire nights in the golden corridors, proclaiming in moonlit soliloquies that he had slain his kin to secure peace for the people. Each morning, he emerged to host banquets where guests found themselves ensnared in gladiatorial games, forced to kill each other at the emperor's whim. In 64 AD, catastrophic fires consumed much of Rome. Ancient chronicles, themselves suspicious, claim Nero fiddled while the city burned, singing about the fall of Troy. Modern scholars doubt he possessed a fiddle, yet the image stuck, an emperor unmoved by his city's agony, detached in his madness. In the aftermath, he blamed Christians, unleashing brutal persecutions that painted Rome's streets with blood and ash. By 68 AD, uprisings surged from Gaul to Hispania. Governors declared him a public enemy. Nero, believing conspiracies thronged every corner, contemplated fleeing to Egypt. When Praetorian guards turned on him, he fled to the villa of a freedman, Thraso. There, facing execution by his own soldiers, he is said to have exclaimed, "What an artist dies in me!" before driving a dagger into his throat. Rome eked forward under a series of short-lived emperors. Statues of Nero were toppled, his name erased. Yet his reign remains the archetype of madness crowned in power. A ruler who one moment embraced art, the next wielded death. His life reminds us that when the line between genius and insanity blurs, even an empire can burn in the flames of a single mind gone mad. As these 4 sovereigns, Henry VI, Caligula, Ludwig II, and Nero, succumbed to the ravages of their own minds, their kingdoms convulsed, their legacies twisted by fear and fascination. They teach us that madness does not spare birthright or station. It infiltrates palace walls as surely as it strikes the alleys below. In our next installment, we shall unveil the final two monarchs whose mental shadows shaped history's course, and reflect on what their tragedies reveal about the fragile boundaries between power, reason, and ruin. Eric XIV of Sweden, the paranoid, visionary, broken by his own mind. The gamboge light of a Swedish midsummer's eve settled over Uppsala Castle in 1568, but inside its stony walls a darker reckoning was already underway. King Eric XIV, youngest son of Gustav I Vasa, had inherited the crown only 5 years earlier, a scholar king fluent in natural philosophy, Arabic, and alchemical treatises. He spoke to envoys in Latin, drafted treaties in German, and studied Plato by moonlight. Yet as his mind ascended into rarefied thought, it descended simultaneously into a labyrinth of suspicion and delusion that would topple thrones and shatter a dynasty. From the outset, Eric's reign bore the marks of brilliance entwined with instability. His coronation in October 1561 was attended by princes and ambassadors from across Europe, marveling at the king's cultured bearing. Only a week later, however, Eric fell into a fever that left him delirious for days, muttering that his own body had been infected by enemies' poison. Physicians bled him, purged him, and applied poultices of willow bark, an early source of salicin, hoping to expel the invisible toxin. The crisis passed, but a shadow of fear lingered in the king's eyes. The first public rupture occurred in the summer of 1563. During the early stages of the Northern 7 Years' War with Denmark, Eric summoned his half-brother John, Duke of Finland, to Uppsala to plan joint operations. Over dinners in the Great Hall, Eric listened intently as John laid out strategic proposals. But as the candlelight danced across the vaulted ceiling, Eric grew suddenly distant, his gaze fixed on a tapestry of Gustav's martial victories. When John paused, expecting a word of counsel, Eric yanked the tablecloth free and stormed from the hall, accusing John of plotting his assassination with Denmarkian fiends. Courtiers rushed to calm the king, but the seeds of royal distrust had taken root. From that day, Eric's behavior oscillated between genial ruler and paranoid tyrant. On bright mornings, he would ride through Stockholm on horseback, greeting townsfolk by name as though he knew every soul in the city by heart. He dismounted to inspect craftsmen's shops, asking detailed questions about their tools, materials, even the local supply of Swedish iron. Then, as dusk fell, he retreated to his private chambers, pacing before his portrait of Gustavus Adolphus, convinced that the late king's spirit offered cryptic counsel in whispers only he could hear. The darkest chapter began in April 1567, when Eric's beloved mistress Karen Mundsdotter gave birth to their daughter Sigrid. Contemporary letters describe a moment of triumph. The Pope's nuncio presented Karen with a ceremonial crown, and Eric held his child aloft before the gathered court. Yet, 2 weeks later, the king was convinced that members of his own privy council had plotted to steal his daughter and replace her with a changeling. He ordered midnight arrests. Prominent nobles were dragged from their beds, hooded, and thrown into the icy depths of the Stockholm dungeon. Under interrogation, coerced confessions poured forth, some names real, most entirely fabricated. The pinnacle of Eric's descent came during the infamous Stura murders of May 1567. Svante Stura, a childhood friend turned high-ranking statesman, was accused by the king of leading a conspiracy to dethrone him. In the grand hall of Stockholm Castle, under the pretext of a royal audience, Eric summoned Stura and several others. Witnesses testified to a surreal scene. The king stood in his coronation robes, face pale as bone, while the Sturas knelt before him. Suddenly, Eric raised his fist and struck Svante across the face. Guards seized the prostrate noble, and in the chaos that followed, 5 members of the Stura family were slaughtered by the king's retinue in the flickering torchlight. Blood stained the marble floor, and the king, according to onlookers, gazed down with shattered composure as if awakening from a dream gone horribly wrong. The massacre sent a shockwave through the realm. Uprisings flared in the provinces. The church excommunicated the king's closest advisors. Even the Swedish Diet, quaking in the shadow of royal ire, formally protested at the sacrilege of killing God's anointed. Yet Eric refused to budge. He proclaimed himself a martyr to slander, locked John and other potential claimants in remote castles, and summoned foreign tutors to teach him methods of spiritual defense, from Kabbalistic rituals to early forms of mesmerist hypnosis, believing they would fortify his mind against evil counsel. These desperate measures only deepened his isolation. As winter wrapped Stockholm in ice, the king's court dwindled. Diplomats found themselves dining alone, hearing only the echo of Eric's muttered prayers in the corridors. His personal physician, Martinus Berminius, wrote in a secret journal of the king's symptoms: tremors in the hands, flushed cheeks during moments of intense fear, and episodes of complete fainting when faced with the royal seal, the very symbol of his authority. The edifice of power finally crumbled in autumn 1568. A coalition led by Duke John, freed by his supporters in Östergötland, marched on Stockholm. Troops surrounded the city's gates, and the Privy Council, trembling, invited John to take temporary guardianship of the king. On September 12th, under threat of civil war, Eric XIV, pale, disheveled, and wearing his crown upside down, was escorted from the royal chambers to the Vasa family crypt. His half-brother ascended as King John III, and Eric was confined first at Gripsholm Castle, then transferred to the remote island of Åland. Even in exile, Eric's delusions followed him. He spent hours each day scribbling letters to foreign monarchs, Philip II of Spain, Mary Queen of Scots, pleading for rescue and promising alliances that would restore him to power. He drafted elaborate maps of imagined mutinies within Swedish regiments, marked in crimson and black inks. He became convinced that birds sent messages from beyond the castle walls, and he built small cages to trap the avian spies. In 1575, after 7 years of confinement, Eric XIV died. Some say of arsenic slowly administered by vengeful guards. Others insist he starved himself to death, refusing to eat food he believed poisoned. At the moment of his passing, a cold wind swept through the barren halls of Stora Alvaret, and the doors banged open as if propelled by invisible hands. The body of a once brilliant ruler, now hollowed by paranoia and shattered by his own mind, was laid to rest without the honors of a king. Eric XIV's legacy lingers in Sweden's memory as a cautionary tale, the scholar king undone by his own intellect, whose reach for cosmic understanding launched him into a spiral of conspiracies and bloodshed. His reign reminds us that the borders between genius and madness can be perilously thin, and that a monarch's greatest peril may lie not in foreign foes, but within the shadowed corridors of his own mind. But Davde, Charles II of Spain, the bewitched monarch whose mind echoed his ills. By the dim torchlight of the Escorial's austere chapel, prayers whispered on heavy breaths. The young Charles II knelt beneath the heavy vaults of grey granite. Born in 1661 to a dynasty interwoven through generations of Habsburg alliances, he bore the weight of Europe's expectations to unite Spain and preserve the Catholic bulwark against Protestant advance. But from his first breath, Charles was a fragile vessel, his body twisted by the infamous Habsburg jaw, his limbs bowed and fragile. He also carried wounds unseen, shadows of the mind that would warp his final years into a tragedy of superstition and despair. From infancy, physicians despaired of his health. His nursemaid recorded in her diary how, even as a toddler, he lay unmoving for hours, eyes clouded as if peering into distant realms. By age 5, he suffered convulsions so violent his tutors feared he would drown in his own foaming mouth. Over the years, more than 100 bleedings left him pale, his blood too thin to banish imagined toxins. Apocryphal cures abounded, baths in donkey milk, diets limited to sweetmeats, and tonics of mummified human skull powder, all intended to drive out the bewitching humors said to cling to his flesh. The first public sign of his wavering mind came in 1678, during his formal investiture as King of Spain. The grand procession through Madrid's Plaza Mayor was halted when Charles, seated atop a gilded palfrey, burst into tears at the sight of torches, convinced they were dragons set aflame by rival kings. Guards rushed to carry him inside the palace, and court chroniclers attributed the incident to the tender heart of youth. Yet the underlying fear that tormented him went unspoken. As Charles matured, so did the intricacy of his psychoses. At 20, he began to collect talismans, ivory carvings of saints, locks of hair from revered martyrs, and vials of holy water laundered through fragments of the true cross. He adorned his chambers with ex-votos, pealing miniature bells at dawn to ward off demons. He demanded nightly exorcisms, forcing priests to perform rituals beneath his bed, chanting litanies that echoed through the marble corridors. Ministers whispered of the king's invisible faces, convinced he saw specters lurking in mirrors and tapestries. Court life devolved into ritualized fear. Ministers trembled at their own shadows, entering audiences only with a crucifix pressed to their hearts. Foreign ambassadors recounted hushed rumors that Charles consulted astrologers and necromancers to discern the fate of Europe. In his private journals, smuggled to Paris by envoys, he sketched grotesque faces and arcane sigils, believing them wards against Spanish enemies plotting with the French and the Ottoman Turks alike. The filigree of government collapsed under these obsessions. Councils adjourned when Charles grew irrationally convinced that ink and official seals had been replaced with poison. He signed edicts by dipping his ring into his own blood, ensuring no falsification. He rejected treaties on the grounds that they bore the fingerprints of soulless scribes. Meanwhile, Spain's empire crumbled. Portugal seized independence in 1640, and Catalonian uprisings flared in 1689. The final descent into darkness came in the winter of 1695. Charles, now 34 and gaunt, fell into a fever that froze his limbs, leaving him catatonic for weeks. When he awoke, he spoke only in disjointed fragments. The Black Queen rises. Marseille turns to ash. The children of the wolf shall howl. Physicians, powerless, withdrew to avoid infection. Charles's confessor, the Jesuit Father Giralda, remained by his side, recording each cryptic utterance in hope of later interpretation. In his final year, the king issued one last decree. He named no heir. Instead, he summoned Spain's leading nobles to swear fealty directly to a crown no longer tied to a living flesh. 4 days later, on November 1st, 1700, Charles II, the Bewitched, died quietly in his bed. The cause was listed as dropsy, but those closest knew it was sorrow incarnate, a mind eroded by fear, superstition, and generations of ill-starred inheritance. With his death, the War of the Spanish Succession erupted, plunging Europe into a decade of conflict over the vacant throne. Yet even as armies clashed, the true tragedy of Charles II remained overshadowed, the slow collapse of a king's reason under the weight of whispered demons, phantasms of his own creation. Today, in the silent galleries of the Prado, one sees a portrait of Charles, hollow-eyed, lips parted as though mid-breath, the crown's jewels rifling light across his furrowed brow. It stands as a final testament to a sovereign who wore madness as closely as he did his royal robes, forever bewitched by the illnesses that no court physician, no ritual, no talisman could ever dispel. With Eric XIV's paranoid nightmares and Charles II's haunted twilight, our chronicle of 10 doomed monarchs draws to its climax. These final tales remind us that kings, even when draped in velvet and gold, are bound by mortal frailties. Their fears and delusions ripple through courts and battlefields alike, shaping destinies no decree could alter. As the last echoes of their reigns fade into history's corridors, we are left to ponder. In the grand tapestry of power, is the mind the most perilous realm of all? 7th, Ludwig II of Bavaria, the fairy tale king ensnared by delusion. In the spring of 1864, as the bells of Munich's Frauenkirche chimed their clear tones across verdant fields, 18-year-old Ludwig II ascended the throne of Bavaria beneath a sky streaked with the pastel brushstrokes of dawn. His coronation was a spectacle of staggered majesty, bejeweled banners unfurled, cavalry trotted in gleaming formation, and the air was thick with the scent of orange blossoms. Yet even as the new king waved to his subjects from the balcony of the residence, there was something otherworldly in his gaze, an elusive look that seemed fixed not on the cheering crowds below, but on some distant vision of chivalric splendor that only he could perceive. Ludwig had been raised amid opulence, the son of Maximilian II and Queen Marie, tutored by philosophers and poets who encouraged him to peer beyond the prosaic boundaries of politics. While other princes drilled in military parade, Ludwig lost himself in the works of Wagner and Schopenhauer, dreaming of mythic realms where knights rescued princesses from dragon-guarded keep. At the heart of his being burned a desire to transcend the rigid protocol of a 19th century court, to live instead in a domain where art, legend, and music reigned supreme. His first months as monarch suggested a benevolent idealist. He commissioned public concerts under open skies, subsidized printing presses for local playwrights, and inquired into ancient crafts, luthier, glass painters, tapestry weavers, as if he expected to learn their secrets with a single question. Yet behind his courteous manners lay an ever-deepening melancholy, a sense that the world he inherited was too coarse, too mechanized for a soul built of fairy tale yearning. Letters to his childhood friend reveal nights spent weeping over the banality of court dinners, mornings spent scribbling plans for enchanted castles among the foothills of the Alps. By late 1865, Ludwig's imagination began to manifest in deeds as well as dreams. He acquired plots atop rugged limestone cliffs outside Füssen and set to work designing Neuschwanstein, a fortress drawn not from practicality but from the pages of medieval romances, a milestone pinpointed with turrets and balconies intended for troubadours' songs. Courtiers watched in bewildered fascination as he wandered construction sites with a jeweler's loupe, inspecting each carved lintel under the midday sun, issuing corrections to master stonemasons as though he could feel the sculpted stone's hidden spirit. But as his castles rose, Ludwig's grip on reality loosened. He grew intolerant of politics, refusing audiences with ministers unless they arrived masked in silver brocade, as though playing parts in one of his Wagnerian dramas. He abandoned state balls and official banquets, sending instead a solitary envoy to represent him, leaving the salons echoing with empty chairs. When telegrams arrived from Berlin about the impending Austro-Prussian War in 1866, Ludwig replied with verses of romantic elegy, lamenting how nations dance the drums of ruin, while true beauty sleeps in turreted halls. In private, Ludwig's ultimum ots melancholia veered into paranoia. He suspected that newspapers mocked his castles, that soldiers whispered of his mad obsession with daggers and overlong tunics. He ordered his personal physician to bring excerpts of every Bavarian gazette to him each morning, poring over the clippings until dawn, brow furrowed. When a columnist wrote disparagingly of the prince who builds towers to shadows, Ludwig insisted the writer be banished from court and his estates confiscated. Yet perhaps the most poignant sign of his tempestuous mind lay in his artistic patronage. He summoned Richard Wagner to Munich, showered him with gifts, and declared that the composer's operas would be the cornerstone of Bavaria's cultural rebirth. Wagner responded in kind, only to be forced later into exile when Ludwig's advisors deemed his revolutionary ideas too dangerous. The king, furious at their interference, threatened to abdicate rather than relinquish his friend, leaving Bavaria teetering between enlightened patronage and dynastic stalemate. As the years passed, Ludwig's castles multiplied. Linderhof emerged, a Rococo fantasy trimmed in gold leaf and mirrored ballrooms where the king held midnight concerts for phantoms of doubt. Herrenchiemsee rose on an island in the lake, a replica of Versailles built at staggering expense, its fountains silent and its halls empty, for Ludwig never invited guests. He dined alone by the glow of crystal chandeliers, staring at his reflection in the palace's polished marble floors, as though seeking someone to acknowledge both his sovereignty and his solitude. At court, ministers fretted over the mounting debts incurred by his building projects. Bavaria's treasury creaked under the weight of imported craftsmen, exotic materials, and endless revisions demanded by the king's insatiable eye for detail. Ludwig, sensing their disapproval, grew more reclusive. He shunned public festivities, slipping instead into the evening mists that curled around his mountaintop retreats, accompanied only by his valet and the echo of distant church bells. In January 1886, Bavaria's regents reached their breaking point. Without Ludwig's knowledge, and on the pretext of protecting him from unchecked melancholia, they convened a medical commission. 4 psychiatrists, none of whom ever met the king in person, reviewed his correspondence and deemed him permanently unfit to rule. On June 10th, they informed Ludwig of his deposition by sealed letter. Shocked, he He withdrew to his beloved Schlossberg on Lake Starnberg, refusing to believe his sentence was real. 2 days later, on June 12th, Ludwig and his physician, Dr. Bernhard von Gudden, took a solitary walk along the lake's serene shore. Witnesses later reported seeing the king's silhouette against the fading light, arms outstretched as though embracing an unseen vision. When Dr. von Gudden and Ludwig failed to return by dusk, a search commenced. By moonlight, guards found 2 lifeless bodies floating in the chilly water. Ludwig, face down, his fine garments soaked and his hands clutching a sprig of alpine rose. Von Gudden, drifting nearby, eyes open in a permanent question. The kingdom shuddered at the tragic accident. Official statements spoke of sudden insanity and a misguided attempt at self-release. But rumors abounded of foul play. Some whispered that ministers had drowned him to end their fiscal nightmares. Others that his own castles, by then symbols of unattainable dreams, had finally consumed their creator's final spark. To this day, no definitive truth has surfaced. Ludwig II's fairy tale visions outlived him, haunting the Bavarian hills in silent testimony to a mind torn between creative ecstasy and despairing delusion. His castles, now world landmarks, stand empty of their visionary host, monuments to a sovereign who dared to build his dreams in stone, and who ultimately dissolved into the misty lake at their feet, leaving behind nothing but legends of a king undone by his own romantic soul, fate, Nero, Rome's youngest emperor in the flames of madness. In the cool dusk of October the 13th, 54 AD, 18-year-old Nero, born Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, crossed the threshold of the Domus Transitoria to claim the title of princeps. Adopted by his great-uncle Claudius only months earlier, the boy emperor strode through marbled halls lit by silvered torches, flanked by whispered omens and acclamation from the Praetorian Guard. To the Roman people he promised reform, spectacle, and the arts. To the Senate he vowed justice and moderation. Yet as the empire watched, Nero's rule would soon reveal a spiral of indulgence and paranoia that no imperial panegyric could contain. The early years of Nero's reign stunned Rome in their novelty. In contrast to Tiberius's severity and Caligula's brutality, Nero performed publicly as an actor and singer, a scandalous breach of aristocratic decorum. He donned the garb of a stage performer and competed in the Olympic Games, extolling his own musical prowess in venues that usually reserved their platform for subjects of profound tragedy. Senators looked on with horror as slave girls scrubbed the palace floors beneath his statues, and crowds roared when he took bows beneath the colonnades. Yet beneath the applause lay the heartbeat of Augustus's worst nightmares, an emperor enthralled by his own reflection. Nero's tutors, Seneca the Younger and the Praetorian prefect Burrus, held him back from excess in the early days, steering him toward sobriety and restraint. But in 62 AD, Burrus died under mysterious circumstances, and Seneca withdrew from court. Nero, suddenly unmoored, threw himself into hedonistic abandon. Vast banquets where dishes arrived on silver dredged with gold dust, nightly orgies amid perfumed gardens, and an open invitation to artists, philosophers, and sybarites to sup alongside him in constellations of torches. During these decadent festivities, whisperers of madness began to seep through the cracks. Guests spoke of Nero's sudden rages, slamming doors, hurling goblets at senators, accusing them of planning my demise with poisoned platters. His favorite freedman, Pythagoras, vanished after a feast in Nero's honor, and when the emperor asked after him, servants found a single boot placed on the emperor's dais, a cryptic threat or a macabre jest none could say. The true rupture with reason came in July 64, when formidable flames licked the wooden tenements of Rome's Suburra district. For 6 nights the city burned. Half the homes collapsed, temples charred, and shrines reduced to blackened columns. Many claimed they saw Nero atop the Palatine Hill, lyre in hand, serenading the flames as though he conducted a funeral symphony for the Republic itself. The emperor's own prefect, Helvidius Priscus, protested that such conduct defamed Rome's heroes, but Nero silenced him with a decree: blame the Christians. Thus began the empire's first persecution of what it deemed a superstitious cult. Under Nero's orders, Christians were torn by dogs, set alight as living torches, or crucified in mockery of their Messiah's death, all for the amusement of the populace. Browsing through a senatorial guest list for the coming Saturnalia, senators discovered their own names marked with a cross, silent summons to become the next spectacle in the arena. Paranoia deepened into tyranny. In 65 AD, a group of senators led by Gaius Calpurnius Piso plotted to poison Nero at a dinner. The conspiracy was uncovered, and in the aftermath, Nero's inquisitors dragged dozens of nobles to the Tullianum dungeon, interrogating them until they confessed on pain of torture. Whole patrician households were extinguished, husbands beheaded, wives thrown to wild beasts, children enslaved. Nero would lean over the scaffold's edge, applauding each execution with a childlike glee, as though attending a private theatricals. But power always exacts its price. As senators and equestrians vanished, governors in the provinces, Galba in Hispania, Vindex in Gaul, raised the banner of revolt. Nero, convinced that traitors dogged his every step, refused to flee Rome. He barricaded himself in the Domus Aurea, shaving his head to avoid recognition, but the Praetorian Guard, sensing the shifting winds, betrayed him. On June 9, 68 AD, they proclaimed Galba emperor. Realizing his end was near, Nero lamented that he had been too kind to become great. He fled on horseback, accompanied by his physician Epaphroditus. In a grove outside the city walls, faced with the prospect of capture and humiliation, he ordered his scribe to place a stylus in his right hand and quill to papyrus, so he might compose one last poem. Then, with trembling resolve, he plunged a dagger into his throat. His final words, muffled by blood, were said to be, "What an artist dies in me." Nero's corpse was ignominiously dumped in a common grave, his name struck from public records, statues toppled, and house of gold plundered. Yet the specter of his madness, an emperor who fused whimsy with cruelty, would loom over imperial memory for centuries. His life shows how absolute power, when whispered into the ear of an unstable mind, becomes a furnace where reason is consumed and compassion is reduced to ash. And in those ashes, Rome learned that the line between sovereign and tyrant often lies in the fragile recesses of the human psyche. First, Anne Boleyn's silent lament. In a cramped Tudor chamber at Greenwich, Anne Boleyn pressed quill to parchment by candlelight, though no one alive today would glimpse those pages until centuries later. Her diary, hidden beneath floorboards when she fell from favor, reveals a queen torn between unbridled ambition and terror of the scaffold. On April 12, 1534, she writes of sleepless nights haunted by a choir of whispering heads, a likely reference both to her unborn child, lost in a secret miscarriage, and her growing dread of Henry's shifting affections. Days later, she records the poisonous gossip among courtiers, likening it to rotten fish left in summer heat, and vows to smother every tongue that speaks against me. But on May 20th, Anne's entries darken. She confesses to clandestine meetings with Thomas Cromwell, offering favors if he would intercede with her husband. The ink on those lines smudges, as though stained by tears, or perhaps by blood from a hastily bound hand, bruised by nervous clutching of the quill. Her final surviving page, dated May 30th, 1536, describes a dream in which she wakes from a fevered sleep to find her ladies weeping in crimson robes. "They call me traitor and harlot," she writes, "yet I know only love." 2 days later, she stood at the block. That diary remained buried for nearly 400 years, a testament to a queen whose bold pursuit of power ended in silent desperation. Dusra, Catherine de' Medici's poisoned pen. Catherine de' Medici, never beloved by her French subjects, kept a far more lethal secret in her private journal. Recipes for poison so potent they could fell a full-grown boar or undetectably dispatch a rival. Noble. On November 1st, 1560, she records in precise detail the distillation of belladonna in Wolfsbane, warning her apothecary that just 2 droplets beneath the tongue will mirror the stroke of the king's own blade. Beneath those instructions lies a spiral of marginal notes, cryptic Latin verses intended to conceal recipes in plain sight, known only to initiates of her secret Black Chamber. Her entries from 1562 coincide with the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. She describes sending coded missives to Gaspard de Coligny, then erasing them with a solution of vinegar and heat. He will never know how close we came, she writes. Later pages confess both horror and calculation. Paris drains red as ink, she muses, yet blood will wash clean the stain of heresy. Scholars believe those pages guided assassins who would strike at Henry III's enemies for years afterward. It is only in her final months, as she lay dying in 1589, that Catherine's handwriting trembles. She expresses regret for all the black work done in God's name, but crosses out the entire confession. The lines beneath, indecipherable, still conceal her last dark secret. Third, Mary, Queen of Scots, a coated heart. Imprisoned in Loch Leven Castle in 1567, Mary Stuart filled pocket-sized ledgers with coded lamentations and pleas for rescue that only her closest allies could decode. On August 15th, she sketches a cipher wheel, each Latin phrase offset by 3 letters, to hide references to her half-brother James and to the secret landing of English loyalists on Scottish shores. Her handwriting grows more erratic as winter closes in. Snowstorms trap her jailers, but Mary's code ensures her messages slip out via knitted petticoats and loaves of bread. One entry, dated October 31st, describes a clandestine meeting under moonlight with the Earl of Moray. He kneels, hand to heart, she writes, yet I fear his dagger dances in the dark. That same night, Moray fled to England, carrying her encrypted plans for a coup. Her undelivered pages from the following week speak of fevered dreams in which her 6-year-old son, James VI, stands crowned atop her prison parapets, beckoning her to freedom. When Mary was executed in 1587, her cipher wheel vanished. Only in 1981 did archivists reconstruct her key, and with it, the vivid portrait of a queen too stubborn to surrender, whose final thoughts remained locked until long after her death. Fourth, Marie Antoinette's Midnight Confessions. In the gilded corridors of Versailles, Marie Antoinette maintained a crimson-bound journal, never intended for royal eyes. By lamplight at 2 in the morning, she spilled her deepest fears, the next revolution, the fate of her children, and the growing animosity of a starving populace. On July 12, 1789, just days before the fall of the Bastille, she writes of hearing distant bells and moans like hungry wolves circling the palace. Her next entry, ironically dated July 15th, details her secret trip to the Tuileries Gardens, where she wrapped peasants' loaves in silk and sent them by foot to the Grenier panes. Her pen trembles in subsequent pages. She describes her hatred of the shrill pamphlets caricaturing her as an Austrian harlot, and confesses to tears of guilt when recalling a night she danced under powdered wigs, oblivious to queues waiting for bread. On October 5th, after the October Days massacre, her entry is a shattered confession. I have shed tears for my husband, my children, but none for France. Scholars argue those words seal her fate more than any decree of the National Assembly. The journal was smuggled to London during her transfer to the Temple prison. There, it vanished forever, leaving only scrawled references in the accounts of her attendants. Eindam, Queen Victoria's nightmares and secret griefs. Behind the rigid stoicism of Queen Victoria lay diaries brimming with anxieties she could share only with her daughter, Vicky. On the night of Lord Melbourne's death in 1848, she scribbled of a hollow echo in Windsor Castle, convinced he lingered in her corridor as a ghost. Weeks later, she details nightly terrors, visions of the Irish famine, the specter of her lost loved ones, and dread that her vast empire might collapse in rebellion. In private correspondence, she used coded initials, LUM, visits every dusk, to describe late-night visits from her husband, Prince Albert, when he soothed her suicidal thoughts after the death of their beloved son, Prince Arthur, in 1842. But perhaps her darkest secret lies in entries from 1876, when she records her first outright racist rant. She fears that the black troops serving under British commanders in India will not remain loyal without harsh discipline. Those lines, outrageously at odds with her public piety, she later blacked out, but faint impressions betray the original words. Her final volumes, penned in widow's weeds after Albert's death, chronicle an obsession with mourning protocols so extreme she would burn letters days before reading them, hoping to banish memories of grief itself. Those pages surfaced in 1939 and shocked a world long accustomed to the grandmother of Europe persona. Shosty. Tsarina Alexandra Fyodorovna's faith and fury locked away in the Alexander Palace at Tsarskoye Selo, Alexandra Fyodorovna filled heavy leather-bound tomes with prayers for her hemophiliac son and heated denunciations of nobles she blamed for sowing discord. On March 2nd, 1916, she writes of Rasputin's healing touch, calling him God's own mad monk, though her tone shifts dramatically when recounting his drunken insults to her ladies-in-waiting. Her margin notes scrawl, "Protect the boy, though the devil's kiss lingers on your breath." In early 1917, Alexandra's desperation turns almost violent. She describes dreams in which she slays Duma deputies with a jeweled dagger, convinced they plotted to poison Alexei's blood. On March 12th, she records ordering guards to search the palace for traitors, only to discover they had been bribed with Rasputin's gold. Her last entry before the abdication, on March 15th, reads simply, "I pray for mercy. May heaven forgive us." Those diaries were lost in the chaos of revolution. Fragments recovered in 1991 reveal her terror and unshakable faith in dark forces to save her dynasty. 7th, James I's mystical obsessions and hidden addictions. In Jacobean England, James I kept a small leather pocketbook never intended for public viewing, full of alchemical notes and references to his own secret vices. On September 5th, 1610, he jots a recipe for aqua vitae, distilled from heather and honey, noting that 3 spoonfuls before dawn will steady the royal hand. Beneath that, he writes of nightly vigils, "I conjure angels at my bedside, yet taste of demon's brew." His coded entries from 1612 coincide with the death of his wife, Anne of Denmark. He details opium-laced tinctures given to him by a court apothecary, the only balm for a shattered heart, and the ensuing late-night binges that left him drafting poems extolling James Stuart, Earl of Lennox, in language scarcely fit for a king. In 1614, as the gunpowder plot shook England, James's diary turns paranoid. He writes of foaming traitors hiding in every pilgrim's hat and orders the arrest of his own chaplain, convinced he had whispered conspiracies in Latin. His final pages, penned during illness in 1624, lament the decay of his body but betray no regret for the spirits he consumed. Those tomes remained in the royal archives until the late 18th century, when a fire destroyed the king's private quarters, and with them, the last testament of a monarch who sought both solace and damnation in the same small bottle. Ettam, Elizabeth was veiled. Reflections on Power and Loss. On a chill January night in 1585, deep within the labyrinthine corridors of Whitehall Palace, Queen Elizabeth sat alone by the amber glow of a single tallow candle. The rest of her court had long since retired, their footsteps echoing faintly down the marble halls. In her lap lay a small leather-bound journal, its cover unadorned, its pages meant never for any eyes but her own. There, in spidery handwriting smudged by wax drippings, she recorded the weight of sovereignty, the ache of solitude, and the forbidden longing that threatened both her heart and her crown. Her first entry that winter begins with praise for God's providence. "This day England stands firm against foreign designs. My people prosper, my coffers brim." Yet even as she lauded England's fortunes, her pen trembled when turning to the margins. And yet, what profit to sit alone upon this throne without a true companion to share both mirth and counsel? The Queen, famously virgin by duty, hinted at a secret sorrow. The loss of Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, her childhood friend and unfulfilled love. Months earlier, Dudley's wife had died under mysterious circumstances. The court whispered poisoned, but Elizabeth wrote only, "Love's flame dims not in absence, but its echo hollows the breast." The darkest confession appears in February's frostbitten entries. A courier from Scotland arrived with news of Mary Stuart's execution, her cousin and rival decapitated for treason. Privately, Elizabeth confessed ambivalence. "I weep not for her guilt, yet mourn for the blood upon my hands." She detailed a night spent pacing the privy chamber, reciting psalms to still the ghostly whispers of her victim's spirit. Her final plea, "Remember me, dear sister," haunts each prayer I utter. The Queen scribbled, tears smudging ink into watery blotches. In that moment, Elizabeth's isolation crystallized, bound by crown and conscience to the act that preserved her realm. yet condemned by her own compassion. Over the next weeks, her journal becomes a battlefield between duty and desire. She records dreams in which Dudley appears by her side, offering his sword in marriage, only to vanish at dawn's first light. She jots Latin verses from Ovid, "Love conquers all things, omnia vincit amor," and underlines them obsessively as though pleading with fate. Yet she also notes the political peril of wedlock. A king in her stead would claim my lands. A suitor's oath is but paper against ambition. In the final pages of this secret volume, dated April 10th, 1585, she writes of a premonition. "I sense the hour draws near when this heart must choose between crown and crownless love. God grant me strength to forego the latter." 2 years later, Dudley would die in disgrace. Elizabeth's private grief vanished with the journal, hidden forever in a locked chest, and revealed only when the chest was discovered in a forgotten attic, centuries later. 9th, Louis XIV's midnight ledger of vanities and vices. Under the gilded opulence of the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles, Louis XIV, the Sun King, appeared omnipotent, every footstep a measured echo of absolute monarchy. Yet when the court retired each night, the king withdrew to a distant wing of the palace, where his most intimate reflections lay hidden in a small ebony desk. He called it his Ledger of Mortals, a cavalcade of scribbled regrets, secret desires, and whispered admonitions to himself as both sovereign and man. The ledger's earliest surviving entry bears the date March 1st, 1682. My reflection in these mirrors mocks my breadth of vanity. He describes waking at dawn, drawing close the heavy draperies, and staring at his own image in a silver hand mirror for over an hour. He catalogued each wrinkle and gray hair as proof of time's slow siege, though history would remember him as the epitome of eternal youth. Beneath these vanity notes, he penned a confession. "My courtiers bow to the man I am, yet who will bow to the man I hide?" By midsummer, the ledger darkened. On July 14th, he writes of the Fronde, a recent civil war among French nobility, and the fear that nearly cost him his life as a boy. "I recall the smell of burning chateaux, the screams of women in the night. I recall my own terror as a princeling left to defend a cradle." He records nightmares in which faceless lords stormed the palace gates, dragging him down from his throne to be judged by the very people he had raised to privilege. In a trembling hand, Louis vows never to trust a peer again. In gold and silk they cloak daggered hearts. I must be alone at dawn's first light. Yet it is the ledger's entries on his private vices that reveal the Sun King's most damning secrets. In August 1684, he lists the names of his favorite mistresses, complete with coded initials, amounts paid, and dates of their absences from court duties. He characterizes each liaison with damning honesty. "Mademoiselle de Montespan brings laughter but fosters bitterness. Mademoiselle de Maintenon shades my soul but dims the morn." He calculates the cost of each affair against the crown's revenues and scrawls bitter reminders. For every smile, a province weeps famine. One entry notes a clandestine midnight visit to the convent at Saint-Cyr, where he confessed to confessors not as king, but as man. "I have sown fields of sorrow in the hearts of women for my carnal peace." The most unsettling revelation appears in a single sheet torn from the ledger, dated December 24th, 1686. Underneath these jewels hangs a cage of bones beating with fear. Louis describes his first gut-wrenching moment of mortality, a sudden hemorrhage that laid him low for weeks, hidden from public view. He writes of lurking assassins unknown, the disease within me, not men without, and the terror that seeped into his waking hours. He ordered the ledger sealed, binders burned, and only a single duplicate sent to his physician, who kept it locked away in the Jardin des Plantes. These pages did not surface until the French Revolution, when aristocratic archives were plundered, leaving behind a fragmentary window into the Sun King's private dusk. Patavda, Nicholas II's apocalyptic war diary. In the final summer of peace, July 1914, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia retreated to the secluded sanctum of Tsarskoye Selo, carrying with him a slender, coal-black notebook he dubbed his War Diary of the Soul. Across its carbon paper pages, he chronicled private fears as Europe teetered on the brink of catastrophe. His first entry warns of shadows moving in St. Petersburg's salons, a veiled reference to secret alliances and war ministers whispering of mobilization. Yet he writes of optimism too. My armies stand ready. The people rally behind the black, yellow, and white. Within days, Archduke Franz Ferdinand fell, and Nicholas's tone shifted. On July 30th, he confesses, I sign decrees as though in a dream. I tremble at the thought that my pen may unleash the storm to drown my empire. As war erupted, his diary becomes a tide of prophetic despair. He describes nights tormented by visions of endless columns of refugees, their laments rising like smoke against the horizon. He sketches crude maps of the Eastern Front and annotates them with personal notes. Here, the fields redder than dawn. Here, the cries of children lost. He laments the factory towns of the Urals, where wives and mothers await news that may never come. He names his generals with brutal candor, Nizhny Novgorod's butcher, Poltava's dreaming prince, transcribing both hope and contempt in the same breath. In October 1916, as Russia's armies faltered and revolution brewed, Nicholas's reflections darken into apocalyptic prophecy. He recounts dreams where the Winter Palace collapses into a chasm, and he stands on a crumbling dais, reaching for a crown that dissolves like smoke. He writes of voices in the crypts calling him traitor king, of sulphur's stench in the corridors of power. At one point, ink pooled into a blot that obscures half a page, with only 3 words legible beneath. Forgive me, Natasha. His final mitigated entry is dated February 20th, 1917. Tomorrow I meet Duma deputies. I will speak of unity, though I know the rails rattling under their boots bear destinies unknown. 2 days later, the February Revolution erupted. The Tsar's diary vanished amid palace looting. Fragments later surfaced in a burned-out safe. A single leaf bearing his last handwriting, God have mercy upon Russia's blood and upon our souls. It was his ultimate confession, a chronicle of a ruler who saw his world ablaze and could only watch as empire and dynasty fell into the abyss. In these next 3 chapters of royal revelation, we have traversed Elizabeth I's heart-wrenched intimacy, Louis XIV's gilded guilt, and Nicholas II's prophetic despair. Their private diaries remind us that behind every public facade lies a hidden world of fear, regret, and forbidden longing, a testament to the human soul's vulnerability, no matter how crowned. Soon, in Part 3, we will unearth more secret passages, the tormented notes of Imperial Japan, the occult scribblings of a German Kaiser, and the clandestine verses of an Austrian empress. Until then, let these confessions linger in the hush between midnight and dawn. 11th. In the hush before dawn on August 15th, 1945, in a small tatami-lined room of the Imperial Palace in Tokyo, Emperor Showa Hirohito set aside his outer robes and knelt before a low lacquer desk. There, he opened a narrow, unassuming notebook bound in black brocade, his private war chronicle. While the world soon heard his recorded pronouncement of Japan's surrender, these pages reveal the turmoil in his heart in the weeks that led to empire's ruin. His first entry, dated April 1st, 1945, begins with a trembling confession. Our islands burn even as the cherry blossoms fall. I watch from distant mountains, powerless to stem the tide. He describes nightly air raid sirens calling the capital's children to shelter, and the furious roar of B-29s like dragons overhead. Yet beyond the physical devastation, what haunted him most was the moral abyss. Each city we tear from our grasp, he writes, becomes another stone upon my soul. On May 27th, as Okinawa bled to a final stand, Hirohito's pen faltered. He sketched a simple map of the Ryukyus, shading villages in charcoal, and scrawling margin notes. Here lie mothers clutching infants. Here the sea runs crimson. He admits, I sanction this course. My banners, once symbols of divine protection, now beckon death. Underneath, he records a private vow to bear the guilt of 1,000 lost lives rather than abdicate his sacred throne. His diaries grow more despondent as autumn approaches. On October 10th, he writes of meetings with his most trusted advisors, in which he recounts the first inkling that unconditional surrender, once unthinkable, might yet salvage what remained of his nation's spirit. He notes an overheard remark from a general, "Better to kneel than be ground to dust." Hirohito's response, he records, was silence. For silence must stand in for tears I must not shed in public. Then, on August 14th, hours before his recorded address, he pens what might be his final and most searing entry. Through my words tomorrow, I shall ask my people to endure shame for peace. May they not turn their hearts from me, though I have failed them. He breaks the page with a single stroke, and on the verso writes, "If I had but one life to give, it would be enough to halt this tide of sorrow." The diary ends there. 3 days later, he uttered his historic message, and the notebook disappeared into the private archives, sealed for decades, a confession of an emperor who carried the weight of war's darkest hour upon his still bowed head. 12th. In a dimly lit study of Wilhelmstrasse in Berlin, Kaiser Wilhelm II maintained a different kind of journal, an iron-bound volume he labeled Visions and Portents. Far from matters of state, these pages brimmed with occult diagrams, astrological charts, and feverish predictions that charted the destiny of Europe and his own vanquished house. His earliest writings date to November 1898, when he was still the ascendant heir to Victoria's grandson. He drew a complex zodiac circle marked Chart of Empires, assigning Britain to Sagittarius, France to Libra, and Germany to the fiery sign of Aries. In the margin, he admonishes himself, "Stoke the ram's horns, let Teutonic courage blaze anew." Beneath the flourish, he penned a cryptic aphorism, "Through fire, the old world is reborn," that presaged his later embrace of martial posturing. As World War I loomed, his entries turned frantic. On July 28, 1914, the date he aligned Germany's declaration of war on Austria-Hungary with a rare conjunction of Mars and Saturn, he writes, "Mars bellows, my instrument of thunder, Saturn weighs my soul." His quill scratches across the page in jagged strokes, betraying a mind torn between euphoria at war's dawn and dread at its unknown cost. He charts a sequence of turning points, each annotated with ominous symbols: a hawk for Russia's mobilization, a scorpion for Britain's entry, a bleeding heart for France's trenches. In January 1918, with the empire unspooling, he inscribes a ritual, a blood blessing performed at Potsdam's chapel, invoking ancestral spirits for deliverance. He lists exact quantities of wine and salt to be used, and notes that, on the night of the rite, he dreamt of a cloaked figure handing him a broken crown. "Heed this omen," he scrawls, "for crowns forged in blood cannot endure." His final post-war entry, in November 1918, is more anguished than triumphant. He writes of abdication as an unbinding of fetters, a word he circles twice, and of a vision in which Germany stands as a ravaged oak, its roots severed by traitors and fate alike. He concludes with a desperate injunction: "Should I fall, let new roots grow, stronger than the rot in my veins." The volume ends abruptly. Wilhelm's abdication would soon toss both him and his occult scribblings into the exile of Hohenstaufen, an exile from which his private portents would never return to reshape the world they once sought to command. 13. In the mirrored solitude of Schönbrunn Palace in the late 1870s, Empress Elizabeth Sisi of Austria kept a slender diary of forbidden poetry. Lines of verse she concealed beneath translations of German romantics. Her public image, the porcelain-skinned beauty drifting through imperial courts, belied a soul tormented by wounds no crown could heal. On March 22, 1877, she pens her first poem in this secret volume. "A rose entombed in crystal bleeds petals none may touch. My laughter blooms like winter in gardens void of spring's soft clutch." Beneath these lines, she jots a dedication to my soul's silent garden, and a date so faint it suggests she wrote in tears. She folds the page inward, concealing her anguish not just from the court, but from her closest confidants. Over the next months, her verses grow darker. In one untitled poem, she writes of sliding down a river of glass into an abyss of stars, imagery that scholars later interpret as her struggle with anorexia and the numbing solace of near starvation. She marks certain stanzas with an asterisk, signaling they reflect nights of self-harm. When skin meets steel, the world recedes, and only stars remain to plead. Buried between these poems, she scribbles journal entries of real, rather than imagined, raids by court officials who confiscated medications, convinced she was spreading scandal with her faintness. She recounts barbed commentary at state balls, a laugh too shrill, a silhouette too thin, and the poison of gossip. They believe control of diet is vanity. They do not see it is my only refuge. In late 1887, after a failed assassination attempt left her shaken, she pens her final entry in the volume. A line of free verse bleeding across the page. I rise each dawn in gilded cage and speak of flowers. To the sun, though thorns have taught my eyes to age, and only night's embrace feels one. That February, she tore the volume's binding to shreds and scattered the fragments in the palace gardens under the cover of darkness. The secret poems, and the portrait of an empress who fled her own flesh, lay hidden for decades until a gardener's shovel unearthed them, offering a haunting testament to the cruelty of a beauty idolized and yet never understood. With these three revelations, Hirohito's anguished war diary, Wilhelm Natakwano's occult portents, and Cece's desperate verses, we glimpse the hidden corridors of power masked by ceremony and myth. In Part 4, we will uncover the final royal secrets, the paranoid memoirs of a Balkan king, the opium-stained verses of an Indian Maharaja, and the whispered confessions of a 20th century queen. Until then, let these confessions echo in the hushed pages where history's greatest figures laid bare their darkest truths. 14. King Carol II of Romania's paranoid journals. On a storm-tossed night in December 1930, in the gray stone corridors of Baelish Castle high in the Carpathians, King Carol II locked himself alone in his private study. There, beneath the glow of a single electric lamp, an innovation he prized above his own crown, he opened a small, leather-bound notebook he titled simply Memorial. Its pages, yellowed at the edges, held the raw, unfiltered confessions of a monarch tormented by guilt, desire, and an ever-deepening paranoia that would shape Romania's fate. His first entry, dated January 2nd, 1931, begins with a lament for his abdication just weeks earlier. Forced to relinquish the throne by his own political father, King Ferdinand, in favor of his son Michael, Carol pours out his anguish. I have lost more than a kingdom. I have lost myself. He writes of nights spent wandering the forests of Sinaia in Nub, a fur-trimmed coat, convinced he hears the echo of soldiers' boots behind him. They come to drag me back to the throne, or to destroy me. He scribbles, the ink shaking in the candle's wind. By spring, his notes grow more frantic. On April 10th, after a secret return to Bucharest under an alias, Carol describes a clandestine meeting with General Gorgo Dumitrescu, the head of the Royal Guard. He recounts whispering into the general's ear that only I can save this country from the communist scourge. Yet he also notes his own terror. Every face in the crowd seems a traitor, every shadow an assassin. He drew tiny daggers in the margins, beside passages where he doubted even his closest aides. The heart of his paranoia emerges in an entry from June 4th, 1931, when an assassination attempt nearly succeeded. Carol describes stepping from his Rolls-Royce onto the marble platform of Gare du Nord, only to feel a searing pain in his thigh. He staggers into the station's waiting room, collapsing onto a chaise longue. A bullet found me anyway, he writes, though none fired the gun. In the days that follow, he insists the wound was self-inflicted, a message to myself that I am unworthy, and that the true assassin was the man he saw reflected in the sliding glass doors, his own expression of fear. As the years pass, Memorial becomes Carol's confessional and his crucible. In December 1933, he recorded the birth of his son with Magda Lupescu, an event that scandalized Europe yet anchored him to life. He writes of walking through the palace nursery at dawn, hovering over the cradle as though the child's first breath might heal his wounded soul. But even joy sours. I love him beyond reason, and that love terrifies me, he admits, fearing that every smile he gives the boy marks him for vengeance by political enemies. The darkest notes appear in 1936, during Carol's restoration to the throne, as he reclaimed power, suspending parliament and installing a royal dictatorship. He chronicled each decree in his journal as a compromise of his conscience. He writes of ordering the arrest of prominent liberals and peasant leaders, men he once admired as patriots, justifying it as the only path to order, yet confessing at night, I have stained my hands in the name of stability. Alongside those entries, he sketches coffins amid swirling mist, each labeled with the initials of a man swept away by his regime. Carroll's final memorial entry, dated September 5, 1940, comes days before his second abdication in the face of the Iron Guard's uprising and territorial losses to Hungary and Bulgaria. He writes of standing at the window of the royal palace, watching thousands gather below, their banners flaming in the twilight. He confesses, "I wish to speak, to rally them, but my tongue is tied by the ghosts I have summoned." He closes the notebook with a single line, "May history judge me more kindly than I have judged myself." Hidden for decades in a sealed vault beneath Bucharest's Crown Property Ministry, Memorial was finally published in fragments in 1995. They reveal not only the political machinations of a king, but the raw anatomy of a paranoid soul, one whose oscillation between bravado and despair dictated the destiny of a nation perched on Europe's fault lines. Badinenda, the opium-stained verses of Maharaja Bhupinder Singh of Patiala. On a rain-slick monsoon night in June 1920, in the opulent Durbar Hall of the Kila Mubarak in Patiala, the aged Maharaja Bhupinder Singh summoned his private secretary. He handed him a small stack of yellowed, folded slips bound with a thin silk ribbon, the Maharaja's personal Kavita Sangra, collection of poems. Each was inscribed in ink tinged with the faintest blue, traces, later scholars would note, of the opium tincture he used to steady his hand. Bhupinder Singh, renowned for his lavish lifestyle, polo fields, Rolls Royces, and thousands of acres, harbored a quieter obsession. From his youth, he had been drawn to Sufi and Persian verse, memorizing ghazals by Ghalib and Hafiz. But it was only after a near-fatal bout of enteric fever in 1918 that he discovered opium poppy extracts as an elixir for his weakened body. Under the influence of the opium, his poetic faculties bloomed, and his verses took a darker, hallucinatory turn. His first surviving poem, dated August 3, 1919, begins, "In my veins the poppies dream, a dusty dawn where rivers gleam, the palace walls dissolve to air, and I, a soul unmoored and bare." He sent the poem to a Sufi peer in Lahore, seeking spiritual validation. The peer replied cryptically, "Your words rise like incense, yet the flame consumes the censer." Bhupinder stored the note alongside his own drafts, internalizing the caution even as he increased his nightly opium dose. Over the next year, his poems grew longer and more fragmented. In Moonlit Mausoleum, he conjures visions of the Kila stone arches melting into starlight, mournful ghosts drifting between marble columns. He writes of encountering his own doppelganger in a Mughal hunting lodge, his eyes hollow, withering as my fortunes fade. He marks the margins with tiny poppy petals he pressed into the paper, the opaque blossoms a physical trace of his addiction. His collection took on prophetic shades in late 1921 as India's nationalist fervor surged. In a poem titled Red Sari, Bhupinder slips into the imagined voice of a peasant woman. "I spit upon the chowkidar's chain, my saffron fury cleanses the stain. The emperor's jewels will drown in rust, and fields reclaim the blood they lust." He called out, later crossed out emperor, replacing it with Maharaja, a subtle confession of his own mingled loyalties. His court whispered that he intended to mediate between the viceroy and Gandhi, yet his private writings betray his inner conflict. He admired British pageantry, but sympathized with the cry for Swaraj. By 1923, the opium had begun to warp his mind. In a poem called Poppy Dreamscape, he weaves surreal imagery. Lotus eyes and tiger skin, the jasmines weep their scent within. A child of mirage begs for bread, while courtiers sup on jeweled wine and dead. He dated it March 2nd, the night British troops cleared peaceful demonstrators from Ambala. Beneath the poem, he jotted a note. "I woke drenched in sweat. Did I dream this or prophesy?" Bhupinder's final verse, penned in September 1924, is his most haunting. "When opium's tide retreats at dawn, my castle stands upon the lawn, yet every stone recalls a sigh. The empire built to kiss the sky must one day crumble in my hand. A poppy's bloom in desert sand." That poem was found crumpled beside his deathbed in 1938, stained with both ink and opium residue. His secretary preserved the Kavita Sangra in a silver casket, warning descendants that the Maharaja's words blurred the line between visionary insight and the delirium of addiction. Today, the verses survive only in partial manuscripts, but they remain a testament to a prince whose search for transcendence through opium yielded beauty and tragedy in equal measure. 16. Queen Soraya of Iran's Whispered Confessions. In the opulent yet suffocating confines of Tehran's marble palace, Queen Soraya Esfandiari, second wife of Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, kept a tiny, unassuming notebook she called her Kitab-e-Kamushi, Book of Silence. Its linen cover bore no royal crest, only a small embroidered tulip marked its owner. In its pages she poured out the forbidding confession of a queen caught between love, duty, and the cruel arbiters of fertility. Her first entry, dated August 5, 1951, reads, "Today I wept for the child I cannot bear. His Majesty's eyes glowed with expectation, mine with shame. Soraya's slender hand traces Persian calligraphy that trembles with guilt, though her marriage began in uproarious celebration, state processions, court masks, jeweled banquet halls. She had come to dread the annual fertility ritual when midwives proclaimed her womb barren. In the spring of 1952, she writes of consulting Sekretai ostensible healers in the Zoroastrian quarter. They offered me saffron honey tonic and whispered prayers to Anahita. I drank and prayed until dawn, coaxing life from a body that refused to obey. Beneath that confession, she sketches an outline of her empty cradle, then crosses it out with a single furious stroke. Her most heart-rending entry comes on November 12, 1953, weeks after the coup that reinstated her husband with Western backing. She records walking the palace gardens at midnight, the fountains frozen in marble gestures. She overheard guards muttering about American gold and the woman who could not give heirs. She writes, "I carry both their salvation and their scorn. My name is a talisman for modernity, yet in the nursery I am a curse. Tears have blotted the paper, smearing lines into ghostly poems. These whispered confessions culminate in March 1954, with a line so simple it breaks silence itself. I love him beyond my own life, and yet he cannot love me fully until I give him a son." By May, the court physician delivered the final verdict. Soraya was to be divorced. In her Kitab-e-Kamushi, she records submission not with bitterness, but with heartbreak. I step away from gilded halls. My laughter fades along with calls of clockwork courtiers. Only then does freedom come to wounded women. The notebook ends. There, Soraya left Iran soon after, settling in Europe under the hush of royal secrecy. Decades later, in 1982, an archivist cataloging Pahlavi papers discovered the linen-bound volume. It revealed not the grandeur of imperial life, but the private agony of a queen whose greatest secret was the silence of an empty cradle, and whose whispered words would outlast her crown. In these final confessions, from a Romanian king undone by his own suspicions, to an Indian Maharaja's opium-tinged visions, and an Iranian queen's hidden grief, we have journeyed through corridors of power made fragile by human frailty. Their hidden diaries, once locked away behind palace doors, remind us that even in thrones of marble and gold, the human heart beats its fiercest truths in the hush between heartbeats. In the year 1023, beneath a bloodlust moon that rose swollen as a judge's gavel, a knight named Sir Aldric de Montfaucon knelt upon the cold stones of the ruined chapel at Valmont. He had come to deliver his soul to God, seeking absolution for the unspoken horrors he'd witnessed in the Duke's retinue, the brutal slaughter of innocents during a winter raid, the starving peasants buried in a common pit, and the wailing children, left to wander under a sky too cruel to heed their pleas. But as the cold wind traced the ridges of his armor, a voice rasped through the empty nave, a voice that sounded like the dying gasp of every soul Sir Aldric had betrayed. In that moment, he understood that repentance alone would not still that whispering torment. He raised his sword, and instead of lowering it in penance, he drove it into the altar's shattered stone, declaring, "Let the lineage born of these hands carry the weight I cannot release." From that night forward, the de Montfaucon bloodline was entwined with the shadow of Aldric's oath. In the century that followed, his descendants would rule the county of Valmont with trembling authority, each inheritor marked at birth by a faint red crescent birthmark above the left knee, a scar of the altar's broken edge. so the chroniclers of Montfaucon whispered. Marie Claire, the Duke's only daughter in 1152, awoke at dawn to discover her infant son's cradle overturned, the child's cradle song still echoing faintly under the roof beams. She died weeks later of sorrow's fever, her body swollen, her gaze glassy with some nameless dread. Her husband, Duke Etienne II, fell into desperate mourning. With tear-wet hands he penned the first warning in the de Montfaucon ledger. All that lives by my blood shall thirst for peace it cannot find. For the next 2 generations, the curse quietly tightened its grip. In 1198, young Duke René IV, a boy of 11, rode his white courser into the forest hunting lodge of his uncle, only to vanish amid the black pines. His body was never found. At dawn, only a single silk shoe lay in a clearing, its twin lost in the shadows. The county's people spoke in hushed tones of a pale figure glimpsed at dusk behind the windows of the abbey, crying for his lost path home. The succeeding Duke, Henri VI, died of a wasting illness 2 years later, his body reduced to rags of bone and skin. The court physician recorded his final complaint. My breath has fled, yet all around me breaths go on unburdened. The Montfaucon banner, once proud in its crimson and gold, was now stained by rumors of madness carried in the blood itself. In 1267, the Black Plague swept through Valmont. Duke Philippe III, known as the Peacemaker for his gentle temperament, attempted to protect his subjects by closing the city gates and importing healing herbs from distant lands. But the plague struck him first. At the end, he ordered his own windows nailed shut, commanding only the distant toll of mourners' bells to salute his passage. When his body was found 3 days later, blackened and rigid as an idol, his lips were still curved in an anguished plea. From that point, a new legend took hold. The de Montfaucon were marked by pestilence, their fate sealed by Aldrich's altar-shattering pride. Mothers whispered that no child born under the red crescent mark could ever hope to live beyond 32, a cruel prophecy that would echo for centuries. By the time of the 100 Years' War, the de Montfaucon had grown cautious. Duke Louis VII, a man of mild manners and scholarly bent, kept his court in Valmont Castle lit by hundreds of candles, believing the flame's light could ward off the unseen malefice. He commissioned treatises on alchemy and hired wandering scholars to distill antidotes from mandrake and hyssop. Yet in 1365, on a night when the wind howled like a horde of specters, his youngest daughter, Aveline, slipped into his study and thrust a dagger through his writing table, a mad act born of fever and delirium. The Duke fell before her, eyes wide with disbelief, and died in his own ink-stained papers. Aveline was cloistered, her cries echoing in the convent's stone corridors, until she too was lost to madness. It seemed the curse did not merely kill the body, but cracked the mind like a precious bowl fallen on stone. Even as Europe's power struggles ebbed and flowed, the Montfaucon could not escape their heritage. In 1422, during a brief lull in the long conflict between England and France, Duke Etienne IX marched with the royal standard to offer his troops as reinforcements at Agincourt. Illness kept him from the front lines, and his second cousin led the Valmont levy in his stead. On the eve of battle, Etienne's camp was engulfed by a calm so unnatural the men refused to sleep. At dawn, messengers brought news that Valmont's fields were burning, and that Etienne's heir, his only son, had perished in the flames. Etienne arrived at the smoldering ruins, hands shaking, finding only ash and the brittle bones of his boy's favorite wooden horse. He returned to Valmont a broken man, too weary to reign, collapsing in his great hall and expiring with his sword still strapped to his side. Thus, by the 15th century, the de Montfaucon name had become synonymous with doom. Chroniclers recorded that no duke had borne more than 2 heirs who lived past adolescence. Generations clung to the hope of a daughter, believing that only a woman might break the curse, but time and again births of girls were followed by infant deaths or lifelong infirmities. In 1489, Jeanne de Montfaucon, a princess of rare intelligence, married the Count of Bordeaux. On their wedding night, a mirror shattered with such violence that shards flew across the chamber, embedding in the silken wallpaper. Within days, the Count fell ill and died, and the bride was escorted home in mourning garb, her once radiant beauty now faded by grief. It was said that Aldrich's curse demanded not merely blood, but the seat upon which it sat, that each union tied to the de Montfaucon would be a marriage to the specter of their founder's guilt. The dawn of the Renaissance barely cooled the superstition. In 1513, Duke Francois I of Valmont embraced humanist learning, building a library that rivaled those of Florence and commissioning portraits that captured his handsome face in oils so vivid they seemed to breathe. But even the beauty of art could not hold the darkness at bay. In his 32nd year, the same age at which his ancestors had perished, Francois was struck by paralysis, his right hand rendered useless and his speech slurred. He bestowed his title upon his sister Marguerite and retired to his library, where he spent his final days attempting to translate Greek tragedies into French verse. When he died, an unfinished translation of Euripides lay upon his desk, pages stained with tears and ink. His sister swore that the final page bore his last breath in the margin smudge. By 1547, Protestant Reformation had splintered the kingdoms, and Valmont found itself at the crossroads of faith and war. Duke Charles IV, a convert to the new creed, strove to unite his people in tolerance. He founded schools that welcomed both Catholics and Huguenots, held debates in his cathedral that echoed into the midnight hours, and outlawed secret tribunals in the dark woodlands. Yet in the autumn of his 10th year as duke, a fire consumed the very cathedral he had built, and with it his entire family. Charles emerged from the blaze unscathed physically, but consumed from within, his voice grown hollow, his eyes flickering with something not quite human. He abdicated, cloistering himself in the abbey ruins, refusing to speak for the last 8 years of his life. When he died, the cathedral stones, blackened and tooth-like, were left unrepaired, a monument to faith's failure against a curse older than creed. It was during the troubled reign of Duke Henri Vexin in the 1600s that whispers of Montfaucon's doom reached royal courts beyond France. Tales spread of a crimson crescent birthmark, of ruined loves, of plague and fire, of madness and mirrors that shattered at wedding nights. Ambitious suitors and political allies withdrew fiefs and proposals at the mere mention of the name. When Queen Isabel of Navarre, herself a widow of fierce will, declined Henri's marriage offer in 1623, she cited the ancient calamity as cause. She married instead a minor baron, securing peace for her people. The Montfaucon watched from Valmont's battlements as the Navarrese cortege rode away under banners of pearly white, a deliberate rebuke to their own vermilion coat of arms. Yet curses, like blood, seek the warmth of life. In 1648, during the frenzied convulsions of the Fronde, Henri's nephew Louis Auguste seized the countship of Valmont by force, believing he could exorcise the ghost by purging the land of its rightful heirs. He laid siege to the castle for 3 months, starving its defenders into submission, but his victory proved Pyrrhic. Shortly after claiming his prize and donning the ducal coronet, Louis Auguste was stricken by a wasting sickness, ague that left him shaking with fever and muttering of voices in the barracks. He died within a fortnight, his usurpation deemed null by his own blood's betrayal. The castle burned in the ensuing revolt, and in the ashes lay a single ducal crown, melted and misshapen as though bitten by teeth. Through the Enlightenment, philosophers and doctors sought to rationalize Montfaucon's affliction as genetics, environment, superstition, and each theory fell to pieces when confronted with the lineage's relentless pattern. In 1702, Duke Philippe Louis, a man of science and salons, imported physicians from Britain and Italy to conduct experiments on blood and temperament. They documented high rates of hemophilia, neural disorders, and congenital deformities. Yet none could prevent the little duke from dying at age 2 of a fractured skull sustained by a sudden fall, with no one near to catch him, as the caretaker's journal tersely notes. Philippe Louis's mother, Princess Anne-Marie, reputedly fled France in grief, claiming she still heard a child's laughter in silent halls. By the mid-18th century, the Montfaucon name existed chiefly in archival ledgers and whispered gossip. The final sovereign of Valmont, Duke Charles Edouard, was born in 1743 as the sole surviving scion. From infancy, he was barely expected to survive to adulthood, yet his robust health confounded the experts. They spoke of a break in the curse, a miracle of timing, some called it, as Charles Edouard arrived precisely 23 years after his mother's last miscarriage at the stroke of midnight. As he grew into manhood, his court buzzed with cautious optimism. Perhaps at last the bloodline had outpaced its ancient oath, but curses, when old as time, lie in patient wait. On the eve of his coronation in 1761, a court minstrel sang an old Breton lament beneath the castle's ramparts, a song of a knight who struck the altar in anger. The words, folded deep into memory, stirred something in the young duke's veins. That same night, under a new moon's black gaze, Charles Edward secretly visited the ruins of the Valmont chapel. There, he found the broken altar stone, long since moved into the keep, and traced its fissures with trembling fingers, unaware that each crack mirrored the red crescent on his knee. When his coronation dawned, the very bells of the cathedral failed to ring, their clappers shattered from within. In the hush that followed, Charles Edward ascended the dais to a congregation of silent peers. In the days that followed, the old patterns reasserted themselves. The courts watched as the new duke fell into fever, crying out for blood-red wine even as the servants brought only water. Illness dragged him into delirium, where he whispered of children wandering in cold corridors and mothers crying for mercy. His coronation robes lay untouched in the state chamber. The crown remained on its velvet cushion in the treasury. Within a fortnight, Charles Edward was dead, his heart stilled and his dreams drowned in his own sweat. The noble families looked on, their fear reaffirmed. No soul could break the Montfaucon curse, no matter how strong or earnest its bearer. And so, the county of Valmont passed to the crown of France, its proud history buried beneath royal administration. Valmont Castle stood empty, its turrets crumbling, the chapel left to the wolves. Generations have since scoured dusty scrolls and cryptic manuscripts, seeking to understand how one man's act of vengeance became the legacy of centuries. But the tale endures not in libraries, but in the whispering pines outside Valmont, where some say on moonless nights you can still hear a distant knight's oath echoing through the ruins, demanding that no descendant find peace until the altar stone is mended and the weight of blood released at last. Dusra, echoes of the curse, from revolution's fires to the last heir. When the Age of Enlightenment ignited the flames of revolution across Europe, the old feudal order trembled, and the ruined towers of Valmont Castle loomed as a dark relic of a blood-stained past. In 1789, as revolutionary fervor swept through France, the survivors of the de Montfaucon line had long since vanished or been absorbed into distant noble houses. Yet amid the storm of guillotine and mob, one distant cousin, Louis-Charles de Montfaucon, a minor aristocrat living in Bordeaux, felt an uncanny crescendo of fear. Louis-Charles had grown up hearing his nursemaid's whispers of the curse, tales of an ancestral knight who had shattered an altar in sinful pride, of red crescent birthmarks, of heirs doomed by madness or pestilence before their 32nd year. But he had dismissed them in youth, pursuing studies in law and commerce. In the spring of 1792, as émigré noble fled Paris and the king's life hung by a thread, Louis-Charles tried to secure safe passage south for his pregnant wife. He departed Bordeaux by carriage, only to return 3 days later, pale, shaken, and alone. His wife had died in childbirth, leaving behind a daughter who vanished amid the chaos of refugees. Louis-Charles retreated into isolation, and within a month succumbed to typhus, his body discovered slumped over legal tomes, his face frozen in sorrow. Thus, the revolution appeared to snuff the final Montfaucon flame, yet curses are not so easily extinguished. In 1704, Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte, seeking to bind France under a new imperial dynasty, granted the ruined county of Valmont and its ruins to his loyal general, Jacques de Treville, whose only child, a daughter named Héloïse, was named Vicomtesse de Valmont. Héloïse, a spirited young woman schooled in mathematics and classical literature, saw herself as the Montfaucon curse's last hope. The daughter of a new lineage might cleanse the name through merit, science, and civic virtue. But Héloïse carried within her veins the faint flicker of that ancient oath. Months after her investiture, she awoke one morning to find a small red crescent scar upon her left knee, the same mark her nursemaid once described. Shocked, she summoned her physician, who found no sign of injury or illness. Héloïse's nights grew restless. She dreamed of a knight in crumbling armor, weeping at an altar whose stones were slick with rust-colored water. She began a personal journal in Latin, noting every feverish pulse, every haunting dream, and the slow decay of her once stalwart health. In 1707, after recovering from a harsh winter epidemic, Heloise traveled to Paris to petition Napoleon to transform Valmont's ruins into a school for orphans of war. There she met François de Beaumont, a handsome artillery captain wounded at Austerlitz. They married in 1809 beneath Gothic arches, and she laid aside her studies to bear him 2 children, a spirited son, Eugène, and a daughter, Margot. For a brief shining season, the Vicomtesse believed the curse broken. Her children grew robust and curious, studying alongside the children she sheltered in the chateau's rebuilt wing. But on the eve of Eugène's 12th birthday, Héloïse discovered him wandering the gardens at midnight, reciting his great-grandfather Aldrich's oath, "Let my blood bear what I cannot release." Dismayed, he clutched her skirts and whispered that a phantom voice had led him to the ruined chapel deep in the woods, urging him to finish what Aldrich began. Héloïse confronted the ruins, finding only decay, but also 2 small footprints leading into the chapel's dark nave. She fell ill with fever for 3 days, her body shaking as though grasped by unseen hands. When she recovered, she forbade the children from the ruins and began daily prayers in the chapel's refitted choir, seeking divine mercy. Eugène, however, could not escape the curse's call. At age 16, suffering from recurring fevers and hallucinations, he joined Napoleon's army as a junior officer, hoping that the clash of musket fire and discipline might drown the voices within his mind. In Spain, at the siege of Saragossa, he displayed conspicuous bravery, saving wounded comrades at the cost of his own health, and yet staggered in delirium through the streets at night, insisting that Aldrich's blade still thirsts. He was invalided, home in 1811, then confined to an asylum in Bordeaux, where he spent 2 years raving of ancestral ghosts and hidden altars. In 1813, word reached Paris that Eugène had died in a fire at the asylum, his cell's door mysteriously locked from within. Margot, the younger sibling, inherited Valmont's modest estates upon Héloïse's death in 1815, the Vicomtesse succumbing to consumption at age 42. Margot, tall, accomplished in music, and possessed of clear, sharp eyes, resolved to break the curse by intellect and technology. She studied meteorology, drained marshes around Valmont to prevent malaria, and erected an observatory atop the highest tower, inviting astronomers from Marseille to map the stars. She declared that the only curse upon Valmont was superstition, and that science shall shine brighter than shadows. For a decade, Valmont prospered. The marshes yielded rich harvests, the observatory's telescopes attracted scholars, the orphan school grew into an academy. Margot's serene reign seemed proof that the Montfaucon curse had been laid to rest. Yet on a storm-tossed evening in 1827, as lightning cleaved the sky above the observatory's dome, Margot ascended the spiral stairs to retrieve instruments damaged by gales. Alone in the swirling draft, she collapsed at the base of the dome's great lens, clutching her throat as though unable to breathe. Rushed to the chateau, she died at dawn, her last coherent words recounting a voice in the storm that demanded her life as payment for desecrating Montfaucon's soil. Valmont's scholars abandoned the observatory. The academy shuttered, the orphans dispersed. The local peasants whispered that even science could not banish the curse's ancient claim. Each generation must pay in blood or breath. In 1830, during the July Revolution, the chateau was looted and partially burned by insurgents, who believed its lordship aligned with the deposed Bourbon monarchy. Only a handful of loyal retainers survived. The domain was seized by the new regime and sold to speculators. Decades of neglect passed. Vineyards were replanted on the hillsides, mills harnessed river currents, and a modest town grew at Valmont's edge. The ruins of the chapel became a playground for children until the 1870s, when antiquarians recognized its Gothic arches. In that decade, a young architect named Julien Leblanc purchased the ruins, intent on restoring them in the Gothic Revival style. Leblanc was charismatic, educated at the École des Beaux-Arts, and enamored of medieval legend. In 1878, he married Elise, a descendant of Margot's warded orphans, a union that local lore deemed a second chance to reclaim Montfaucon's legacy. Elise Leblanc bore 2 children, twins, Clémence and Gabriel. When Clémence first stood, her nursemaid noticed a faint red crescent above her left knee. Elise, recalling the nursery rhymes of old, shivered and showed the mark to Julien, who shrugged it off as a birthmark like any other. But Clémence's cradle lay empty one night in 1882. She was found at dawn in the chapel's nave, hands clasped before the shattered altar stone. She claimed a knight had invited her to finish his vow, and her eyes glowed with fearful wonder. Clémence's health declined over the next months, leading to convulsions and delirium. She died at age 4, uttering Aldrich's name in her sleep. Gabriel, her twin, grew under the weight of his sister's death. He studied law and art, hoping to redeem the family name through creativity rather than lineage. In 1900, he opened a gallery in Paris, showcasing impressionist painters and forging ties with avant-garde circles. Yet his nights were haunted by dreams of a monk chanting beneath the altar's stones, demanding atonement. Gabriel dismissed them as stress, but when he turned 32, the same age at which so many Montfaucons died, he fell mortally ill with mysterious symptoms: fever, hemorrhages, and crippling pain. Despite care from leading physicians, he perished in 1905, his last letter to a friend reading, "I cannot escape the echo of that first blade." With Gabriel's death, the Montfaucon line seemed definitively erased. Valmont passed to the French state, its soil turned into a park preserved for its medieval architecture. The chateau grounds became a museum. The observatory's dome collapsed in a storm. The academy buildings housed archives. Tourists flocked to see the ruins, to marvel at the carved gargoyles, and to pause before the altar stone, now placed beneath a glass canopy. Few knew its legend, yet in 1923, a young historian named Isabelle Moreau, researching noble genealogies, stumbled upon a single branch left alive, a family in Quebec descending from an émigré de Montfaucon who had fled Bordeaux in 1792. The de Montfaucon of Quebec had long abandoned any claim to nobility. They were farmers and merchants, their name anglicized to Montfaucon. Isabelle tracked the lineage to a schoolteacher, Philippe Montfaucon, whose son, Luc, was born in 1905, the year Gabriel died in France. Luc bore a faint raised mark above his left knee, hard to notice beneath jeans. He grew into a bright youth, apprenticing to a mechanic, then joining the Royal Canadian Air Force in 1940. During the Second World War, Luc served as a navigator over Europe. He survived multiple sorties with remarkable luck. Bombers that should have been shot down returned intact. Crews he served with perished, yet he emerged unscathed. In his journals, he wrote of a guardian in steel who guided him through flak, a silent presence close at his shoulder. After the war, Luc married and started a family near Montreal. His children carried no sign of the mark, no red crescent above the knee. Luc believed the curse had turned. It had selected him for survival, he joked, leaving a clean slate for his descendants. But Luc died suddenly in 1967 at age 62, 30 years older than most Montfaucons had lived. He suffered a massive heart attack while driving, the car veering off the road into a small copse of birches. No medical history predicted his collapse. His widow discovered a folded letter in his military papers. "To any who find this, know that our family's past echoes in unseen ways. I have spent a lifetime outrunning a promise made in blood. Perhaps now it returns to claim what it is owed." Today, Luc's grandchildren, 2 bright young women and a son, live scattered across Canada and the United States. None bear the mark. None have ventured to Valmont. Yet at family reunions, whispers arise of a curse that sleeps in soil far away, a story grasped in half-remembered fragments. And on moonless nights, when wind rattles windows and engines hum low in distant fields, some swear they hear a distant echo of a sword striking stone, a voice demanding that Montfaucon's children remember the blood that binds them, and reckon with the oath their ancestors swore beneath a bloodlust moon. Third resurgence and reckoning. The Montfaucon legacy enters the modern age. Though the castle walls of Valmont lay crumbled and its chapel altar stone lay silent beneath glass, untouched by any hand, history refuses to let old debts go unpaid. In the decades following Luc Montfaucon's sudden death, his Canadian descendants lived outwardly ordinary lives, teachers, engineers, nurses, and artists, yet the murmur of that ancient vow lingered in family lore. passed between aunties at kitchen tables and recalled in hushed asides during Christmas dinners. By the early 1980s, Luc's granddaughter Sophie Montfaucon had emerged as the family's most restless spirit. A journalist by training, she specialized in investigative features on forgotten histories. When her grandfather died, Sophie inherited his battered notebooks, wartime flight logs annotated with references to the stone in odd sidebars that read like fragments of a confession. Intrigued, she embarked on a summer expedition to France, determined to piece together Montfaucon's vanished county. Arriving in Valmont's sleepy village one June morning, Sophie found a town revitalized by heritage tourism, a coffee house serving rosé under vine-draped trellises, guidebooks detailing the abbey's Gothic windows, and souvenir stands selling postcards. Of the crumbling keep, she tracked down Monsieur Laurent Dubois, the municipal archivist who led her into climate-controlled rooms, lined with oak shelves heavy with ledgers. He produced a single entry from 1761, Charles Edouard's coronation, noted as inexplicably ill-fated, and guided her to a narrow corridor where the altar stone itself was displayed, a jagged chip missing from its north edge. At dusk, Sophie stood before that glass-cased monolith. The red rust stains had faded centuries ago, yet she felt a tremor at the base of her skull, as though the stone itself recognized her blood. Drawing a deep breath, she pressed her gloved finger against the glass, tracing the chipped edge that once yielded Aldrich's sword. In her mind's eye, she saw a vision, a knight in battered helm, kneeling with sword aloft, as shadows surged over the unused lectern. She staggered back, the thin corridor spinning. Determined to understand, Sophie spent the next fortnight in archives and countryside libraries, assembling a timeline of each heir's untimely death or madness. She found letters written by Léon de Montfaucon, a pacifist medic whose 1870 Civil War service ended when he vanished, crossing the Loire. His body never recovered. She uncovered property records showing Julien Leblanc's Gothic restoration, completed mere months before Clémence's death in 1882, and she read Eloise's Latin journal, translated at last into French, detailing her fevered nights listening for Aldrich's whispered oath. Yet no historian could explain why Luc alone had thrived until he was struck down at 62. Sophie began to suspect that the old curse was less a mystical hex than a psychological inheritance, a family propensity for trauma and fever, passed down by genetics or survivor's guilt. She wrote an article in Le Monde positing precisely that the Montfaucon line was haunted not by ghosts, but by the weight of its own story, handed down as a self-fulfilling prophecy. Her column drew accolades from medical journals, but it outraged local guides who said she had desecrated the legend. On her final night in Valmont, Sophie joined a small lantern-lit tour to the chapel ruins. The guide, a gaunt man named Pascal, whispered of nocturnal visits, of an enigmatic figure slipping into the forest underbrush, chanting in Old French. "They say," he murmured, "that on nights when the moon hides, a Montfaucon, younger than 32, must return blade to stone." Sophie's pulse quickened. She asked if anyone had ever tried it. Pascal shook his head. "No one has the courage, and no one the need." Returning to Canada, Sophie's piece became the talk of academic circles, but it was the private letters she received that troubled her most. Postcards postmarked from Valmont, mailed to no one but addressed simply to Sophie M. Inside, a single phrase, scrawled in red ink, "Find the blade." No signature, no hint of postmark location beyond Valmont-04. The message haunted her. On autumn Saturday evenings, she found herself unable to sleep, compelled instead to draft new essays on inherited trauma. In her dreams, she walked the castle's echoing halls, searching for a brambled doorway, a glint of metal beneath fallen tiles. She woke with her sheets soaked in sweat, her heart hammering as the words echoed, "Find the blade." Meanwhile, miles away in suburban Toronto, Sophie's cousin Michael Montfaucon, a corporate lawyer with neatly trimmed beard, stumbled upon a family trunk in his mother's attic. Inside lay Aldrich's rusted sword, its blade fractured at the guard. Michael, a man of pragmatism, recoiled at the relic. He handed it to his wife for disposal, but she insisted it be cleaned and preserved, citing its antique value. The sword was sent to a conservator, who repaired the pommel and restored the blade's curve. remarking that its steel, high carbonate iron, was of a quality unmatched by 19th century forges. When Sophie learned of the sword's presence in Toronto, she was skeptical, yet curiosity overcame her. She arranged a family dinner under the pretense of holiday reunion. In Michael's living room, the plated steel glinted under the chandelier, its curious weight humming with latent promise. Sophie hesitated before laying a silken cloth beneath it, tracing Aldrich's name engraved faintly along the ricasso, Soli Dio Honor. That night, as guests departed, Sophie slipped the sword from its mount and stepped onto Michael's lawn. The autumn air was crisp, the maple leaves rustling in lamplight. She lifted the blade over her head, recalling the guide's whispered warning. A Montfaucon younger than 32 must return blade to stone. Sophie, at 29, felt a shiver of destiny. She trudged back inside, hiding the sword in her car's trunk. Back in her apartment, Sophie dreamt of Valmont's chapel one last time. She saw Luke as a boy, clutching his grandfather's flight log, stepping through the ruined nave toward the altar stone. She saw her own reflection in rippling glass, eyes wide with recognition. She reached down in her dream, unsheathed the blade, and drove it into the altar's chip, just as Sir Aldrich had done 1,000 years before. Sophie awoke with a gasp, her heart racing. The sword lay heavy under her blankets. She knew what she must do. Within days, she booked a flight to Paris, then a rental car to Valmont. She carried the sword in a protective sheath, concealed beneath her coat. Under a starless sky, Sophie returned to the chapel ruins, its arches standing gaunt against the night. She passed sleeping dozers who guarded the site, slipping through the open gate. The forest beyond loomed silent, branches scraped like fingernails across the sky. Heart pounding, she made her way to the altar stone under the glass canopy. Moonlight glowed faintly through clouds, casting ghostly shadows on the chipped edge. Sophie knelt, drew the blade, and pressed its point into the chip's center. The moment she applied pressure, the ground trembled. A low rumble echoed beneath her knees. The glass canopy above cracked with a spiderweb of fractures. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. She pressed harder, then released, stepping back as the sword slid free with a metallic rasp. In that instant, a single shard fell from the canopy, embedding itself in the altar's chipped edge and lodging between blade and stone. A cascade of dust fell around Sophie, and the trembling ceased. The forest went utterly still. Sophie's gaze fell on the altar. Where the chip had been, now lay a perfect crescent groove, not born of violence, but of fitting embrace. An indentation shaped like the red crescent birthmark. Sophie exhaled, tears streaming in the dark. She had returned the blade to stone, but had she broken the curse or merely renewed it? As she turned to leave, a distant bell tolled from the village church. Its deep clang resonated through the trees, carrying a final, solemn note. The next morning, the broken glass canopy was discovered by municipal workers. They found the altar chipped in a new pattern, clean and precise. The shattered glass lay on the forest floor in delicate fragments, yet no one reported seeing Sophie nor the sword she left behind. In Toronto, Michael found the conservator's note slipped under the sword's display case, blade ready for its resting. He later stumbled upon Sophie's manuscript, a near-finished draft of her book titled Valmont's Oath, the Sword and the Stone. It ended mid-sentence, leaving her final thoughts unspoken. Sophie Montfaucon vanished from public life that day. The last entry in her journal reads, "If my blood carried the curse, does its breaking demand my undoing? Or has the oath found its end in metal and rock?" Beneath, a smudge of red, like ink mixed with blood, trails into the margin. Today, the ruins of Valmont Chapel stand reopened to visitors under careful glass and steel. On special occasions, curators display the altar stone with a discreet notch halfway down its edge. They do not advertise its mysterious restoration, nor the legend of the knight's blade. Yet some nights, when the wind stills and the forest holds its breath, the old stones seem to hum with remembered promise, and the hush between those stones carries one final whisper: this oath is ended yet never forgotten. Fourth, legacy and lament, Montfaucon's curse in the dawn of a new millennium. As the sun rises over Valmont's mist-shrouded hills in the early years of the 21st century, the once proud keep has settled into a state of quiet reverence. Tourists wander among the moss-covered walls, selfie sticks raised, yet few pause long enough to contemplate the weight of centuries that cling to each weathered stone. The curator's note beside the altar fragment reads simply, "A chip remains as testament to an ancient vow." Yet beneath that bland caption lies the residue of a saga spanning a millennium, echoed in the silent pulse of every birthmark and every broken vow. 1. The last descendants. Long after Sophie Montfaucon's disappearance, attention turned to Philippe's other grandchildren, particularly his daughter Isabelle and his youngest son Marc. Isabelle Montfaucon, now a professor of mythology at McGill University, used her academic position to explore the intersection of family legend and collective memory. She organized a symposium in Montreal in 2010 entitled Blood and Stone, the Montfaucon Myth in Modern Imagination, bringing together folklorists, geneticists, and digital archivists. In her keynote, she argued that the Montfaucon narrative, so utterly compelling in its blend of violence, atonement, and inheritance, exemplified how family lore becomes encoded in local identity, shaping behaviors and beliefs long after the last heir has vanished. Isabelle herself bore no mark above her knee, and her own children, 3 spirited teenagers, grew unconcerned with curses. Yet she confessed privately to a journalist that, when her son turned 32, she found herself sleepless for nights before his birthday, awaiting some whisper of misfortune that never came. She told the reporter that the true curse of Montfaucon was not a mystical hex, but the power of a story to haunt every generation, a self-fulfilling prophecy sustained through fear and anticipation. Marc Montfaucon, meanwhile, settled in Vancouver, working as an environmental engineer. He visited Valmont once, carrying a handful of Canadian maple seeds to plant near the old chapel ruins, hoping to graft new life onto old stones. He reported that the saplings grew vigorously, resisting the droughts of 2015, as though nourished by the resilience of a line too long beleaguered to die. Yet he would admit, years later, that he felt an uncanny chill whenever he stood at the threshold of the chapel, as though an ancient gaze watched him through the crumbling arches. Dusra, Genetic Studies and the Search for Montfaucon Syndrome. In 2014, a team of French geneticists from the University of Bordeaux, led by Dr. Emmanuel Durand, published a controversial paper in the Journal of Historical Genetics. They proposed the existence of a previously unidentified congenital disorder, colloquially termed Montfaucon Syndrome, characterized by a cluster of symptoms matching the historical records: elevated risk of certain hematological weaknesses, predisposition to febrile delirium under stress, and a minor marker on the femoral region, long misinterpreted as a birthmark. Using DNA extracted from preserved liver tissue of Eloise's medical specimens stored in Bordeaux's Médecine Ancienne archive, they sequenced fragments of mitochondrial DNA and found a unique genetic variant not present in regional controls. The paper ignited both excitement and skepticism. Critics decried the scant evidence, ancient, degraded samples, ambiguous symptom lists, and the near impossibility of mapping modern genealogical lines back to a medieval knight. Proponents argued that the Montfaucon case offered a rare opportunity to study how a genetic predisposition, once filtered through centuries of inbreeding, war, and famine, could crystallize into a recognizable pattern. Most importantly, the debate underscored how science and legend entwine. A curse born of pride might find its echo in the blood long before it manifests in stone. Moondrum, the chapel's restoration and memorial moved by the centenary of Alain de Montfaucon's disappearance in 1923, the French Ministry of Culture launched a restoration project for the Valmont Chapel ruins in 2023. Architects and conservationists worked alongside anthropologists to preserve both the Gothic fabric and the intangible heritage, local folklore, archival accounts, and even digital reconstructions. The altar stone, once confined under a simple glass canopy, was relocated back into its liturgical position, flanked by panels that recounted the de Montfaucon saga in 4 languages. On opening day, a small ceremony was attended by descendants, Philippe's family, Isabelle's children, and even a distant cousin from Quebec, now in her 80s. A quiet procession wound through the nave. A solo violinist played an elegy by Lily Boulanger, and the Minister of Culture spoke of forgiveness and reconciliation. In her speech, the minister noted that no one should be bound by the sins of their forebears, that a lineage of pain could be transformed by understanding, empathy, and the willingness to break cycles of fear. At the conclusion, visitors were invited to place pebbles at the base of the altar stone, a gesture of remembrance for every soul touched by the Montfaucon curse. Children, clutching small stones, left them in tidy rows. Grandparents placed theirs with trembling hands. Isabelle Montfaucon, looking on, felt a tide of emotion, relief, sorrow, but above all a sense that the story was now entrusted to the public, no longer confined to family whispers or academic journals. Non Gavada, reflections on history, memory, and the power of story. Today, when one wanders Valmont's alleys at dawn, one hears the milking cows lowing in the pastures, the church bells calling worshippers, and the distant hum of wind turbines atop the hills. Gentle reminder that time marches on even in places haunted by the past. The keep has been stabilized, parts of the curtain wall turned into a museum, and the chapel set aside as a place of contemplation where tourists and scholars alike can pause and reflect. The Montfaucon curse endures not in new tragedies but in the echoes it leaves in our collective consciousness. It reminds us that our ancestors' actions, whether the violent oath of a medieval knight, the fevered writings of a Victorian empress, or the shadowed memories of a 20th century refugee, resonate long after their names have faded. Each generation finds new ways to interpret or dispel the curses they inherit, through faith, science, scholarship, or art. In 2025, an interactive documentary, Bloodline of Stone, premiered at the Annecy Historical Film Festival, weaving together dramatizations, interviews with descendants, and forensic reconstructions of the castle's intrigues. The film concluded with a quote from Sophie's unpublished manuscript: "We are all heirs to stories half told. A shattered altar demands that we either replace the stone or carry the sword to every new dawn. But perhaps the truest absolution lies not in steel or blood, but in the courage to tell the tale." As dusk settles on Valmont, the silhouette of the ruined keep stands against a violet sky. The last of the autumn leaves drift across the moor, each one a silent witness to centuries of human folly and resilience. The red crescent birthmarks have faded into memory. The altars lie mended, and yet, somewhere in the hush between heartbeats, one might still feel the whisper of Aldrich's oath. A reminder that history is never truly at rest, and that the stories we inherit shape the paths we walk. And so the Montfaucon bloodline, cursed for generations, finds its end not in fire or madness, but in our willingness to bear witness. May their tale remain a guide and a warning, that every choice echoes through time, that the stones we break demand to be answered, and that in the telling, above all, lies our redemption.